Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Mi nombre es Gail McLean, soy directora del área de Prevención e Innovación de Fundación Paz Ciudadana y a nombre de este y todo su equipo quiero darles una cordial bienvenida a la 12ª Conferencia Internacional Desafíos para la Seguridad de Nuestras Ciudades, Gestión de los Territorios para la Prevención del Delito y la Violencia. Este es un evento que es posible gracias a los esfuerzos de Motorola Solutions Foundation, la Subsecretaría del Interior, la Fiscalía Nacional, Carabineros de Chile y la Policía de Investigaciones, junto a Fundación Paz Ciudadana. En nuestra primera jornada, la temática principal serán los desafíos para la prevención, y particularmente la prevención con foco en los más jóvenes. Y por ello, para inaugurar esta sesión, hoy nos acompañarán para darles la bienvenida la subsecretaria de Prevención del Delito, María José Gómez, y el director ejecutivo de Fundación Paz Ciudadana, Daniel Johnson Rodríguez. Luego de sus palabras, iniciaremos la jornada con la charla magistral titulada Evidence for Better Lives, Evidencia para Vidas Mejores, dictada por Manuel Eisner, profesor Wolfson de Criminología y director del Centro de Investigación de Violencia del Instituto de Criminología de la Universidad de Cambridge, y que solo hace unos pocos días atrás fue galardonado por la División de Criminología Experimental de la American Society of Criminology. Muchas felicitaciones, profesor Eisner. Nos sumamos a los reconocimientos al valioso trabajo que ha estado realizando para avanzar en la prevención temprana de la violencia y el delito. Hoy también tendremos un espacio donde les presentaremos algunas iniciativas prometedoras y buenas prácticas seleccionadas en el marco del 10º concurso internacional sobre iniciativas prometedoras y buenas prácticas en gestión de la información y seguridad ciudadana. Y para finalizar esta jornada tendremos el honor de presentarles la charla magistral a cargo de la profesora Deborah Quetzler, perteneciente al Departamento de Justicia Criminal de la John Jay College e investigadora del Instituto Correctional de la Universidad de Cincinnati, cuyo tema será Estrategias para prevenir la reincidencia delictual de los jóvenes infractores de ley. Les quiero agradecer a quienes nos están acompañando el día de hoy, que se han conectado desde distintos puntos del país, desde distintas partes del mundo, y que pese a los desafíos que nos ha impuesto la pandemia, mantienen intacto su compromiso e interés en participar en instancias como esta, que nos permiten reencontrarnos para compartir y aprender nuevas evidencias, que nos permiten avanzar en hacer de nuestras comunidades, barrios y ciudades espacios más seguros para todos y todas. Les recordamos que están habilitadas en la plataforma de Zoom la función de traducción en 2 idiomas, inglés y español. El icono para activarlo lo encontrarán en la parte inferior de sus pantallas. Es un globo. Por otra parte, durante las charlas magistrales de nuestros invitados, todos quienes nos acompañan podrán participar haciéndonos llegar sus preguntas a través del botón Preguntas y Respuestas. Según el tiempo con el que contemos al finalizar de las charlas, nuestro equipo seleccionará y sintetizará las preguntas que nos hayan hecho llegar. También pueden compartir sus impresiones por sus redes sociales usando el hashtag conferencia FPC. Dicho esto, sean todos muy bienvenidos. Damos comienzo a la primera jornada de la 12ª Conferencia Internacional Desafíos para la Seguridad de Nuestras Ciudades, Gestión de Territorios para Prevención del Delito y de la Violencia. Dándole la palabra al director ejecutivo de Fundación Paz Ciudadana, Daniel Johnson Rodríguez. Bienvenido, Daniel, muy buenos días. Daniel, no te escuchamos. Disculpa, estás muteado aún. No te escuchamos. Francisco, por favor, ¿podrías habilitar a Daniel?
¿Ahí se escucha o no? ¿Sí?
Ahora te escuchamos perfecto, Daniel. Bienvenido.
Me decía que tenían que habilitarme para poder hacerlo, disculpen. Bueno, muchas gracias, Gail, por tus palabras iniciales. Primero, bueno, decirles que es un honor para mí inaugurar esta nueva conferencia internacional de seguridad ciudadana que hemos denominado Desafíos de la Seguridad en nuestras ciudades, gestión de los territorios para la prevención de los delitos y la violencia. Es un honor porque es un aporte tangible del trabajo que hacemos día a día en Fundación Paz Ciudadana para mejorar la seguridad en nuestro país, pero también porque es un trabajo conjunto entre múltiples instituciones nacionales e internacionales que demuestra que es posible, pero también que es necesario abordar la seguridad en forma integral. Quiero entonces comenzar estas palabras saludando a las autoridades y representantes de las instituciones que nos han acompañado y que lo harán durante la conferencia. Ministro del Interior y Seguridad Pública, señor Rodrigo Delgado, subsecretario del Interior, señor Juan Francisco Gali, subsecretaria de Prevención del Delito, señora María José Gómez, fiscal nacional del Ministerio Público, señor Jorge Abbott, general director de Carabineros de Chile, señor Ricardo Yáñez, director general de la Policía de Investigaciones de Chile, señor Sergio Muñoz, gobernador regional metropolitano de Santiago, señor Claudio Arrego, representantes de instituciones nacionales e internacionales vinculadas a la seguridad, funcionarios de estas instituciones, académicos, estudiantes y equipo de Fundación Paz Ciudadana. Esta es nuestra 12ª conferencia internacional, un recorrido ininterrumpido de más de una década que nos ha permitido profundizar en conocimiento, lazos y compromiso, pero también periodo en el que hemos visto profundizarse necesidades y anhelos de seguridad que deben ser atendidos de forma urgente. En la última encuesta del Centro de Estudios Públicos de nuestro país, la seguridad se mantiene como la primera necesidad que nuestras familias manifiestan que debe ser atendida por los gobiernos. Y esto muestra, primero, que las familias sienten que es necesario y urgente sentirse seguras. Y en segundo lugar, que los ciudadanos consideran que no es posible alcanzar esta seguridad individualmente, que se requiere acciones colectivas, de bien común, que deben ser lideradas por los gobiernos e implementadas conjuntamente. Por su parte, según los resultados del Índice Paz Ciudadana, que presentamos la semana pasada, los chilenos nos estamos sintiendo inseguros. Consideramos que la delincuencia ha aumentado y pensamos que lo va a seguir haciendo en los próximos meses. Y esto afecta las condiciones de vida de nuestras familias. Su bienestar se condiciona. En esta misma encuesta, se vio que más del 90% de las familias chilenas han realizado acciones para estar más seguras. Entre ellas han dejado de salir a ciertos lugares y a ciertas horas, limitando severamente sus libertades. Nos hemos empeñado como país en intentar aumentar el bienestar de nuestros ciudadanos. Hemos construido áreas verdes, hemos mejorado los sistemas de transporte, entre muchas otras acciones. Sin embargo, estas acciones no tendrán éxito si estos lugares y estos sistemas de transporte, por ejemplo, no son percibidos como seguros. Y de esa manera se limita su capacidad de entregar los beneficios para los cuales fueron diseñados. Debemos entonces considerar criterios de seguridad en la planificación de nuestras ciudades y comunas, buscando controlar y revertir las condiciones que generan inseguridad, como la segregación, la falta de servicios, y dar a los nuevos barrios condiciones preventivas, desde su infraestructura, a la prevención que hacemos desde las familias para vivir, a la preparación, perdón, que hacemos de las familias para vivir en estos barrios. Para mejorar la situación delictual, debemos buscar los caminos más efectivos, los mangos bajitos, como me dicen que se dice en Colombia. Y estos muchas veces se distancian de lo que nos indica la intuición. Es fundamental mirar las experiencias de otros, ver cuáles iniciativas han sido exitosas en otros lugares y copiarlas con orgullo, porque de esa manera estaremos siendo responsables y avanzando con certeza hacia una mayor seguridad. En estos momentos convulsionados debemos mirar con atención lo que está sucediendo y entre otras cosas que nos dejó la pandemia está el entendimiento de que para avanzar más rápido a veces debemos esperar. Y lo hicimos con paciencia para tener la certeza que las vacunas no hacían daño y que eran efectivas para cada edad. Esta conciencia es la que necesitamos para implementar políticas públicas basadas en evidencia y en particular en materias de seguridad y justicia. Debemos imitar en seguridad lo que la salud aprendió hace varias décadas. La pandemia también nos mostró cómo los cambios de comportamiento afectan el delito. Menos personas en la calle y más familias en su casa hicieron que disminuyeran los robos de manera muy importante. Sin embargo, esta disminución se concentró en delitos menos violentos y que en general producen menos daño, como los hurtos y robos por sorpresa. Por su parte, no disminuyeron los robos con violencia e intimidación y aumentaron los homicidios. Esta diferencia en la evolución de diferentes delitos nos muestran que no basta con contar ilícitos para dimensionar la evolución de la delincuencia en un territorio. Debemos también entender el daño que cada uno de ellos produce. Es por esto que en Paz Ciudadana hemos trabajado en el índice de daño del delito, que lo hemos traído desde un trabajo anterior de la Universidad de Cambridge, que pondera cada uno de ellos por las penas establecidas en nuestra legislación, herramienta que esperamos comience a utilizarse cada vez con más frecuencia para tomar decisiones en la implementación de políticas públicas. Este tipo de herramientas deben permitir gestionar de forma más efectiva nuestro sistema de seguridad y justicia para que con los recursos disponibles, que siempre serán limitados, podamos obtener los mejores resultados en la disminución del delito y la violencia, y más importante aún, el daño que estos generan. También debemos ser capaces de focalizar nuestras políticas en quienes están siendo más víctimas. El mismo índice Paz Ciudadana citado anteriormente nos mostró que las mujeres que se clasifican en un nivel de temor alto duplican a los hombres en este segmento. Que el temor también se concentra mayoritariamente en la región metropolitana y en los grupos socioeconómicos de nivel más bajo, que coincide también con quienes son más víctimas de delitos. Pero no basta con tener más datos, ni incluso más y mejor información a partir de estos datos. Debemos desarrollar las capacidades para utilizarlas correctamente en todos los niveles de decisión y en todos los ámbitos, incluyendo el poder legislativo, quienes deben normar en base a evidencia y garantizar mediciones de implementación e incluso de impacto de las leyes que promulgan. Del nivel central también, del Ejecutivo, cuando se define la Política Nacional de Seguridad Pública y esta se materializa a través de las acciones de nuestras policías y de todos los elementos del sistema de seguridad y justicia que pertenecen al Ejecutivo. A nivel regional también, con la planificación territorial y la priorización del financiamiento de iniciativas locales desde los gobiernos regionales. Y por supuesto, en el nivel local, donde se deben impulsar programas preventivos de violencias y delitos en función de las necesidades de cada territorio. Para esto, hemos impulsado desde Paz Ciudadana nuestro programa de observatorios comunales de seguridad, que permiten el correcto diagnóstico de los problemas que aquejan a cada territorio, la selección y diseño de políticas públicas que sean efectivas, el monitoreo de su implementación y su posterior evaluación, que permita profundizar las que son exitosas y reformular e incluso interrumpir las que no generan los beneficios esperados o incluso pudieran generar perjuicios inesperados. Pero como para lograr esta capacidad de gestión de la seguridad, es necesario también que las autoridades centrales, regionales y comunales prioricen las acciones más efectivas en disminuir el delito, la violencia y la inseguridad. Acciones que en momentos pudieran no ser las más populares. Es fundamental entonces tener una mirada integral, que no considere casi exclusivamente la persecución y su fortalecimiento como la herramienta base para mejorar la seguridad. Debemos lograr una mirada sistémica, que considere acciones preventivas desde las tempranas, que se hacen a cargo de los factores de riesgo de inicio de conducta infractora, promoviendo factores protectores que las contengan. La disuasión eficiente del delito, la persecución inteligente, buscando la desarticulación de sistemas delictuales, un sistema de penas efectivo en la incapacitación para la comisión de nuevos delitos mientras se cumplen las condenas, pero fundamentalmente en la reinserción, a través de la identificación de las causas del involucramiento delictual para tratarlas y evitar así la reincidencia. Todo esto es posible si aprendemos de otras experiencias y priorizamos nuestras acciones correctamente. La conferencia de este año coincide en Chile con un periodo de campaña para las próximas elecciones, donde se definirán nuestras autoridades y esperamos poder influir directamente en los programas de gobierno y en su posterior implementación. Para lograrlo, hemos planificado 4 acciones concretas. La primera de ellas, que se llevó a cabo hace 2 semanas, fue la entrega a los comandos de cada candidato presidencial de una lista de 22 propuestas para mejorar el desempeño del sistema de seguridad y justicia chileno. La segunda fue la realización de la encuesta de victimización, conocida como el Índice Paz Ciudadana, que entregamos sus resultados la semana recién pasada, que nos permite evaluar la situación de inseguridad de nuestro país. La tercera es este seminario que estamos organizando hoy, en el que podremos revisar estudios y experiencias internacionales exitosas. Y la cuarta, que realizaremos en las próximas semanas, es nuestro consejo consultivo, en el cual esperamos contar con la presencia de los candidatos presidenciales con mayor probabilidad de ser electos, para que nos expliquen en detalle sus iniciativas en materia de seguridad y justicia, y podamos evaluar las bases que cada una de ellas considera y su probabilidad de producir cambios relevantes. Esperamos que nuestra 12ª conferencia internacional sea aprovechada por muchos como un lugar de encuentro, en que miramos con atención las últimas investigaciones que se están desarrollando en otros lugares del mundo y experiencias prácticas de iniciativas exitosas. Esperamos que estas insumen los programas de gobierno de todos los candidatos que se encuentran compitiendo por liderar nuestro país para que logremos avanzar a paso firme hacia un país y un continente más seguro. Hemos preparado con gran entusiasmo 3 días de conferencia y estamos orgullosos de contar con invitados del primer nivel internacional que desde su conocimiento centrarán su mirada por unos días en nuestro país, permitiéndonos profundizar en el entendimiento del delito y en acciones efectivas para disminuir su ocurrencia y la inseguridad que genera, aspectos fundamentales para nuestro desarrollo. Hoy, 19 de octubre y primer día de la conferencia, centraremos nuestra mirada en los desafíos para la prevención, como nos contaba Gail hace unos minutos, y nos acompañarán en el análisis Manuel Eisner, profesor de Criminología y director del Centro de Investigación de Violencia del Instituto de Criminología de la Universidad de Cambridge, y más tarde Débora Ketze, profesora del Departamento de Justicia Criminal John Jay College de Justicia Criminal e investigadora del Instituto Correctional de la Universidad de Cincinnati. Mañana, 20 de octubre, abordaremos el tema de violencia y delincuencia en barrios y ciudades, y estarán con nosotros Thomas Abt, presidente del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Delitos Violentos del Consejo de Justicia Criminal de Estados Unidos, quien también dirigió recientemente la Comisión Nacional sobre COVID-19 y de Justicia Penal en el mismo consejo. Y mañana, en la tarde, un poco más tarde, nos acompañará Alejandro Echeverri, cofundador y director del Centro de Estudios Urbanos y Ambientales URBAM de la Universidad EAFIT de Medellín. Finalmente, este jueves 21 de octubre trataremos el tema El cambio cultural como centro de las reformas policiales, y nos acompañarán en la reflexión Loren Sherman, director de investigación del Centro Jerry Lee para la Criminología Experimental y director del Programa Ejecutivo de Policías de Cambridge, y posteriormente Edward McGuire, profesor de Criminología y Justicia Penal de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona, donde también se desempeña como director del Laboratorio de Innovación en Seguridad Pública. Sin duda tenemos la oportunidad de escuchar y conversar con un extraordinario nivel de expositores. Y no puedo terminar estas palabras sin agradecer a quienes lo han hecho posible. Primero, a nuestro coorganizador, Motorola Solution Foundation, al Ministerio del Interior, a la Fiscalía Nacional, Carabineros de Chile y las Policías de Investigaciones de Chile, quienes patrocinan esta conferencia, y en particular al equipo de Fundación Paz Ciudadana, que ha puesto toda su energía y cariño para hacernos vivir estas jornadas de profunda reflexión. Entonces los dejo invitados a participar activamente en todas las actividades que estaremos desarrollando durante los próximos 3 días, y ahora, en particular, a esta primera charla que inaugurará esta conferencia con el destacado profesor Manuel Eisner. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos.
Agradecemos las palabras del director ejecutivo de Fundación Paz Ciudadana, Daniel Johnson, y a continuación presentaremos el saludo que la subsecretaria de Prevención del Delito, María José Gómez, nos ha hecho llegar, quien por razones de fuerza mayor no nos ha podido acompañar el día de hoy. Francisco, por favor, transmite el video.
Quiero enviar un afectuoso saludo a todos quienes participan en esta 12ª conferencia internacional que apunta a la prevención del delito en los territorios y que fue organizada por la Fundación Paz Ciudadana. En nuestra subsecretaría sabemos que este es un tema de la máxima importancia. Por eso, hoy estamos llevando adelante una serie de iniciativas para la prevención del delito y para avanzar en seguridad en los barrios que tienen una perspectiva enfocada en el territorio y en la participación de las personas. Me habría encantado acompañarlos presencialmente en esta actividad, lamentablemente razones de agenda me lo impiden, pero les deseo el mayor de los éxitos en las 3 jornadas que tienen por delante y en las que van a tener un objetivo que compartimos, que es hacer de nuestras ciudades un mejor lugar para vivir.
A continuación, tengo el honor de presentarles a Manuel Eisner, profesor Wolfson de Criminología y director del Centro de Investigación de Violencia del Instituto de Criminología de la Universidad de Cambridge, cuya presentación está titulada como Evidence for Better Lives, Evidencia para Vidas Mejores. El profesor Eisner expondrá en inglés, por lo que para aquellos que les resulte más cómodo se encuentra habilitada la función de traducción al castellano. Muchas gracias, profesor Eisner, y sea muy bienvenido el día de hoy.
So thank you very much for this introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to all of you about some of the work that I'm doing. I will primarily try to emphasize today how important it is to think about the entire life course of human beings from birth into adulthood as the focus of crime prevention. One of the questions that one can ask is, what are the main basic strategies through which crime and violence can be reduced and security increased? And the way I think about it is to distinguish three main pillars. The first pillar are crime control strategies. The second pillar are strategies that aim at changing opportunities and situations. And the third pillar are strategies that aim to change motivations and propensities. So under crime control strategies, we mean strategies such as better and more effective policing, strategies that aim at deterrence and incapacitation, strategies that include monitoring and surveillance such as CCTV cameras, for example, or more police patrols on streets, but also strategies that aim at reintegration of offenders in order to reduce reoffending. Strategies that change opportunities and situations are strategies that are linked to the costs and benefits of committing a crime. So this includes, for example, burglar alarms, locks, or CCTV cameras that are aimed at making it harder for perpetrators to commit a crime. Reducing access to weapons is one of the strategies here. Changing profits that one can accrue from committing crimes, such as profits from drug trafficking. And finally, it's important to bear in mind that much of this these days depends on using technologies to change and reduce opportunities for committing crime. And finally, there is a bundle of strategies that aims to change motivations and propensities. This includes moral beliefs, such as gender norms, or beliefs about the wrongfulness of committing crime, or the beliefs in the police and the moral order of society. It includes strategies that aim at changing something like self-control and long-term planning, strategies that aim to change adversities and reduce anger, and strategies that aim to improve mental health and well-being, because there are so many findings that show that crime is related to poor mental well-being. In my talk today, I will focus on the motivations and propensities. I would like to start with asking you all a question. Who is this young gentleman here who looks at us with a rather stern view? Now, this young gentleman a few years later looked like this. He was a little bit of a person who was often involved in some fights. You can also see that he looked quite dashing. He's known to have had quite a lot of girlfriends, often in the short run, but he was also a gang member, very active. I don't know whether you can already guess who it was. It was Stalin, one of the greatest mass murderers in human history. If you think about this, it may be interesting to briefly remember some of the features and some of the context in which Stalin grew up. According to Simon Montefiore, Stalin's father, who was called Crazy Bezo, was an alcoholic cobbler. His mother, Keke, spoiled Stalin, but at the same time, she beat him mercilessly. Bezo, who regularly beat up Stalin as a child, sometimes beat him so hard that there was blood in the child's urine for days. And one of the schoolmates, Joseph Iremashvili, said that the undeserved beatings made the boy as hard and heartless as the father himself. This leads us straight away to questions that are at the core of developmental prevention. At what age do antisocial behavior, crime, and violence start? At what time in human development is the beginning of careers and developments that are linked to crime and violence? What are the risk and protective factors during childhood that predict adolescent and adult criminality? Is it possible to reduce adolescent and adult criminality by addressing these childhood risk factors and strengthening protective factors, strengthening resilience? And how can we examine the effectiveness of these early prevention and intervention programs? Always bearing in mind that if we try to intervene early in human life, it takes many, many years and sometimes decades to find out whether they have been effective. Another way to think about it is to ask the question, could Stalin really have been prevented with a proper early prevention program delivered in late 19th century Georgia? And if I ask this question, my answer would probably be not necessarily. And of course, human history and human structures and politics played an important role. But there might be a role in reducing the damages that Stalin was exposed to, and hence probably changing the kind of personality that he was. I will focus mainly in my rest of my talk on individual level targets of developmental crime prevention. And I would like to focus on strengths that humans acquire as they grow older. In my view, an important way to think about this, or one possible way to think about this, is to distinguish 4 skills that humans acquire as they grow older. One is cognitive skills, skills such as self-control, or skills that are also known as executive functioning, long-term planning, and the ability to assess the consequences of what one is doing. A second domain are emotional skills, skills not to have emotions, but to control emotions, to regulate emotions, and to use them in a productive way. Anger control is one important element. Then there is a dimension of moral skills, beliefs about fairness and justice, the kind of things that we mean when we talk about legal socialization of adolescents. But bear in mind that the development of moral skills goes back far longer, and children at the age of 18 months have clear expectations about what is fair and what is unfair. And finally, there is a 4th dimension, namely social skills. For example, having a theory of mind, being able to imagine what others feel and what others experience, a sense of empathy, and the ability to resolve conflicts. So developmental prevention is about having a developmental perspective across the entire life course. Developmental prevention is not just focusing on early stages of the life. It is about developing adequate interventions at all stages of life. It's based on a multi-systemic approach with initiatives at the individual, the family, the school, and the neighborhood levels. It aims to combine strategies that strengthen protective factors, but also aims at reducing risk factors. It integrates universal, indicated, and selective prevention, and that's important because we know that a very small number of children and adolescents that are at the top end of risk are responsible for the overwhelming proportion of crimes. And so focusing resources on those with the highest needs is important. And finally, it follows a research and development logic and gradually aims to build the evidence base of what works and what doesn't. So I want to focus on one particular dimension of developmental prevention, where I believe that there is particularly good evidence that links developmental epidemiology to prevention science. And this framework is focusing on the notion of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as it is known in the scientific literature. I believe this notion of adverse childhood experiences provides an interesting framework for risk-focused developmental prevention. So let me just briefly go through the question of what we mean by adverse childhood experiences. Of course, children experience all kinds of negative things, and that's part of their normal process of growing up. However, what we mean by adverse childhood experiences are particularly stressful experiences that occur during childhood, which directly hurt a child, for instance, maltreatment or corporal punishment, or that affect them through the environment in which they live, for example, growing up in a house where there is a lot of domestic violence. What are the main dimensions and indicators of adverse childhood experiences? In the literature that goes back about 20 years, one usually distinguishes three main dimensions of adverse childhood experiences. The first dimension is abuse, so directly harm doing to the child. That includes sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. But David Finkelhor has recently argued that outside the family, things like bullying experiences in primary school and secondary school, but also before the start of school, need to be included in the notion of abuse and harm experienced by children. The second dimension is neglect, emotional neglect by the parents, physical neglect by the parents, but also things like peer exclusion and rejection that lead to the isolation of children. And finally, a third dimension are household dysfunctions. So things that the child experiences, witnesses, is exposed to, but not necessarily is directly a victim of. That can be domestic violence among the partners, substance use by one or both of the partners living with the child, or other family members. It can be that a parent is incarcerated, or it can include, outside the family, exposure to community violence that is linked to the functioning of the household. The significance of these adverse childhood experiences was initially discovered by Felitti et al. In an important study that was published in 1998, so over 20 years ago. Felitti was I think still is a medical doctor who conducted a survey amongst almost 10,000 adults of all ages who were participating in a large private integrated care system in the west of the United States. And what Felitti did was to administer a questionnaire where he asked the participant 17 forms of childhood adversities. He was motivated, by the way, to do this because he realized that among patients that he saw who were unable to comply with some instructions about health, he found a very strong proportion of people who had experienced childhood maltreatment. This study was quite revolutionary. It showed, first of all, that different adversities measured in this scale tend to come together. And it showed primarily in that study that childhood adversity was associated with a wide range of negative health outcomes, think about health outcomes. These are physical health outcomes, such as having cardiovascular diseases, obesity, but also mental health outcomes such as depression. And there was very clearly an evidence that the more different adversities are experienced, the higher is the risk of negative health outcomes. And that includes cognitive impairment, disease, mental health, substance abuse, and also early death. Felitti et al. Ended up suggesting a cutoff of having experienced 4 or more ACEs for an indication that the patients, the people that he examined, were really at a high risk of experiencing a substantial increased risk of negative health outcomes. So you could ask, well, why does this matter for crime prevention? I've been talking about health outcomes. And I want to show this to you by means of a study conducted by Mark Bellis in Wales in the United Kingdom. This was also a large study of about 2,000 participants, again at all ages, a representative study. And they showed that in comparison to people with no adverse childhood experiences, those with more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, for example, are 4 times more likely to be high-risk drinkers. They're 6 times more likely to smoke tobacco or e-cigarettes, and they were more likely to have had sex under the age of 16 years. But now look at this. They're 11 times more likely to have smoked cannabis. They're much more likely, 4 times more likely to have been a victim of violence. They're 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person in the last 12 months. They're 16 times more likely to have used cocaine or heroin, and they are 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated at any point in their lifetime. These are, by any standards in the social sciences, very big effects. And you can see here that these effects are particularly strong for activities linked to crime. Why should that be the case? I want to outline just briefly 5 main pathways that have been examined over the past 20 years. One pathway is that repeat exposure to frightening or threatening situations activates a number of systems in the body: the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, the immune system, and the central nervous system. So together they create what Shonkov has called toxic stress. And this toxic stress might affect the functioning of the body in a way that makes the body more vulnerable to illnesses, but also more likely to behave in ways that are negative to the body's health. Chronic stress may lead to detrimental structural and functional changes in brain regions that are related to stress management. And so there are biological pathways that link exposure to chronic stress caused by adversities to the brain development, especially among young children, and the ways that can cope with stressful situations. Experiences of victimization, especially multiple types of victimization, have been shown to be associated with reduced abilities of self-control and long-term planning, because victimization changes the way children perceive the future and assume that the world around them is safe and they can move in this world around them in a way that they can plan. Victimization also undermines trust in others, and it's often been shown to be associated with depression and withdrawal. And finally, experiences of victimization increase negative emotions, including anger and violent ideations. Myself and my team have been doing research primarily on causal mechanisms linked to the last 3 arguments. And I just want to show you one result because I find this particularly interesting. I originally come from Switzerland, which is quite a peaceful country. And a few years ago in the longitudinal study, we examined how many young people think about killing somebody they know. Now, what I can say here is clearly that if young people in Switzerland were acting on the murder fantasies that they have, Switzerland would be wiped out pretty quickly. So fortunately, they don't do what they imagine. However, I do think that having violent fantasies is associated in some way with violent behavior. What we examined in this study was how much multiple victimizations, so adverse childhood experiences, if you will, are associated with the likelihood of your brain, an adolescent's brain, producing fantasies, ruminations linked to murder and violence. This is the association that you can see for males, and you can see that it goes up from about 3% among those who have never been victimized to almost over 70% for those with 20 different victimization experiences. But interestingly, we find the same association among females, where multiple victimizations are associated with an increase in ruminations about killing somebody else. So how does this matter for crime prevention? One of the things I believe that the research on adverse childhood experiences has shown is that reducing experiences of neglect, abuse, and household dysfunctioning at all stages of childhood could potentially make a really significant contribution to the prevention of poor physical health, mental health problems, and early death in adulthood. But also, and that's the link to crime prevention, it shows and suggests that addressing exposure to adversity over the life course could be a major contribution to reducing later crime, violence, and substance use. Let me add here that I think this focus on adverse childhood experiences is so important because it shows us that when we try to think about crime prevention, we should think in the context of broader public health strategies that aim to support a healthy, positive child development and reduce adversities that children experience as they grow older. And so this is how I want to focus now on one study that I'm currently working on, which is called Evidence for Better Lives, where we try to create the basis for promoting the well-being of children across the life course. It's a collaboration with colleagues in 8 universities across the world. What we try to do in that study is to launch a global comparative birth cohort study that is focused on low and middle income countries and that tracks the well-being of children from before birth into adolescence. We want to focus on medium-sized cities and collaborate with international, national, and local stakeholders to use the study to support sustainable citywide change related to violence against children, psychosocial health, and family well-being. And we do this because we think that running randomized controlled trials is important, that it adds to the evidence base, but that at the same time we believe that we need to move beyond experiment and try to understand how we can change entire citywide systems. And finally, we want to contribute to capacity building by creating in each of the cities that participate an interdisciplinary network of research teams, promote early career scholars, and encourage South-South collaboration. Here is a list overview of the cities that are participating in this study. So going from west to east, you see that we include Kingston in Jamaica, Kafaridwa, a small city, medium-sized city in Ghana, Worcester in South Africa, Cluj-Napoca in Romania, Tarlai outside Islamabad in Pakistan, Ragama in Sri Lanka, Hue in the north of Vietnam, and Valenzuela City, one of the constituent cities of metropolitan Manila in the Philippines. So you see that these cities include a broad variety of different cultural structures, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic levels of development, but they all are outside the modern, the affluent Western societies. At the moment, we're working on what we call the foundational study, which is a kind of like a large-scale demonstration that we could actually do this to an even bigger scale. We recruited 100 participants in each site. We recruited them in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy at baseline. We translated questionnaires into 9 languages. We had ethical approval in all sites. I just mentioned this because it's a lot of work to coordinate this across all different sites. And Sara Valdebenita, who is originally from Chile, was essential in making it possible that we get all of these activities coordinated in due course. We did computer-aided personal interviews, and we collected biological samples to measure stress during pregnancy. And I'll show you a few measures that we included in this study. Here is the basic design of the study so far. So we did all these activities: translation, developing a protocol, going through ethics approval, training the field workers across these different sites. Then we did the recruitment in the first part of 2019. And in red, you can see the first wave, which we conducted in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. After birth, broadly after 3 to 4 months, we did a brief telephone-based catch-up interview with the mother, just very brief. And then, of course, we had COVID, but we've been trying to recontact the mothers at about age 24 to 30 months. And currently we have 6 sites still participating in the study: Kingston, Cafarigua, Cluj, Ragamahue, and Valenzuela, while 2 sites are currently not able to continue in this study. So what this will enable us to do is a number of things. For one, we learned something about the effects of exposure to adversities before the child was born, to the outcomes at about age 2 years, but also we've made sure that we learn something about the effects that the exposure to the breakdown, to the lockdown and COVID had on child development. I would like to briefly show you how this study is structured, or the main research question is structured. One of the main interests that we have is how maternal exposure to intimate partner violence is linked to poor outcomes at ages 1 to 2 years. And we've designed the study in such a way that we better understand what the mediating pathways are that possibly link the cause to the effect. Because we believe that understanding the mediating pathways is essential to develop more effective and more targeted prevention strategies. Here are a few selected results. And I want to start with the question, how many of the mothers had experienced a significant amount of adversity in their childhood? So we asked the mothers retrospectively about what happened when they were children. Now we know approximately how many people in the United States and Wales and other Western affluent societies have experienced 4+ adverse childhood experiences. And here is the result. In the United States and Wales, that's pretty consistent across many studies. About 10 to 15% have experienced 4 or plus adversities in childhood. Across the study sites in our study, it's 42%, so a much larger proportion. We can also ask the differences in the exposure to 4 or more ACEs across the 4 sites. And this graph shows you the proportion of mothers who reported to have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences: neglect, physical maltreatment, and domestic dysfunctions. And you can see here, for example, that in Kingston and Worcester, over 2/3 of mothers have grown up in such situations. While, for example, in Hue, in Vietnam, and in Thailand, in Pakistan, the proportion is much smaller. These are big differences between different sites. And I want to emphasize this because I believe it's important to not just think about these patterns as something that operates at the level of psychology, but to also bear in mind sociological research questions and sociological dynamics that are involved here. And I want to demonstrate this to you with one research finding. Namely, the question whether these differences between the sites are associated with levels of social inequality. Now, here is the result, and I find this pretty striking, although, admittedly, the samples that we are using in this study are small and not representative. So this is just tentative. But what this shows is that in societies where social inequality is higher, we also found a much larger proportion of women in our study that had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And that's, for instance, in line with the argument by Wilkinson that high levels of income inequality create overall unhealthy societies. Now, we also know from this study what proportion of pregnant women experienced serious violence while they were pregnant in the community and at home. The study suggests that about 1 out of 3 women experience intimate partner violence during pregnancy, and that about 50 to 60% report observing violence in their neighborhood. Again, look at the big differences between the different sites in the extent to which women during pregnancy are exposed to violence. We need to link these dots. And one of the ways we can link dots that are relevant for prevention science is to ask, what is the association between experiencing ACEs as a child and being abused during pregnancy? On the horizontal axis, here you see the number of childhood adversities that the mother had experienced. And on the vertical axis, you see the proportion of women who then have experienced violence during pregnancy. And what you can see here is that women who were exposed to adversity during childhood are far more likely to experience intimate partner violence during pregnancy. So what we are seeing here is that multiple adversities, stresses come together in the same person. So what we've learned so far is that large proportion of pregnant women in low and middle income countries have experienced adversities. Social inequality may contribute to differences in the exposure to adversities between the study sites. But there is a strong association between experiencing adverse childhood experiences as a child and experiencing perinatal intimate partner violence and experiencing community violence during pregnancy. And we also have seen that women who experienced either or both are much more likely to report depression and stress during pregnancy. The study is ongoing, and I just want to tell you that, of course, one of the things that we will be doing once the 3rd wave data collection is concluded is that we will analyze the hair samples that will tell us something about biomarkers of stress during pregnancy and how they're related to poor outcomes for the mother and the child. And we will understand something about whether early child behavior characteristics are associated with exposure to ACEs during pregnancy. So what are the implications for prevention and intervention of these studies? I think, first of all, it's important to bear in mind that the first 1,000 days after conception are a critical period in child development, and especially child brain development. Early childhood risk factors affect the long-term negative outcomes into childhood, into adolescence, and often into adulthood. And that includes a broad range of different negative experiences. I've also tried to show you that we have plausible models of the causal mechanisms that are involved. So I think we are currently going beyond just showing risk factors to also trying to understand the causal mechanisms that link childhood adversities to poor child outcomes. And I think it's important to understand here that when it comes to experiences during pregnancy of the mother, especially with violence in the community and violence by intimate partners, we are addressing problems that are both linked to the agenda of addressing violence against women and addressing violence against children. These agendas have often been separated in the past, but I believe at the moment we can see a strong movement towards integrating these two agendas. And looking at perinatal violence is one of the ways of doing this. There is now one interesting question here, namely, what should we do if we understand that exposure to intimate partner violence is one of the important adversities that affect both the mother and the child? In the United States currently, there is a strong movement to introduce more screening instruments. And such screening instruments are available. They usually just ask a few questions that try to assess whether the mother, the pregnant woman, is at risk of being exposed to domestic violence. One of the instruments has been adapted in Chile, the woman abuse screening tool. And I'm not sure whether other instruments, or I assume other instruments, are also used in Chile. It's important to bear in mind that screening may be important, but alone it has no benefits. And this is one of the reasons why the World Health Organization at the moment does not currently recommend screening, although they're reassessing the situation as we speak. Screening can make sense, but there is a need for subsequent intervention and support. And unless these support systems are in place, the screening doesn't really make a lot of sense. I thought I might just briefly show you one of the possible models that link screening to intervention. And I've learned about this model from recent publications. It's the Domestic Violence Enhanced Visitation Program called DOVE as an example. It's relatively short. It's a brochure-based and safety planning intervention for pregnant women and mothers with infants who experience interpersonal violence. It's embedded into rural home visiting services for vulnerable mothers. So imagine social services visiting mothers who are at risk or deemed at risk because of substance use problems, because of poverty or other mental health issues or other combinations of difficulties. These programs are delivered by home visiting nurses. There is an initial screening, and then there are 3 sessions during pregnancy and 3 sessions during the postpartum period, and they take about 15 to 25 minutes. The nurses are extensively trained, and it's not a prescriptive program, but the home visitors discuss each woman's individual experiences and then try to tailor the intervention to her expressed needs and the level of danger at each visit. So it's about strengthening and enabling the woman rather than prescribing a certain course of action. What is the role of the police in this? The police and the justice authorities play a crucial role. but as part of a multi-agency public health approach. They receive very often emergency calls and victim reports. They play an important role, of course, by way of arresting perpetrators. They play an important role in training police officers and having specialist units. They can enforce restraining orders and other immediate protection measures imposed by the judge. And I think it's important to think of the role of the police here as an agency that collaborates, cooperates with other agencies, including victim support, social services, safe houses, in order to address the risks, to conduct risk management and safeguarding. So I come to the conclusions. Oops. First of all, I would like to hint at two possible policy implications for Chile. And when I propose these possible policy suggestions, I'm acutely aware of the fact that I have a very limited to almost no understanding of the kind of approaches that are currently in place in Chile. But I believe that an approach that is focused on addressing adverse childhood experiences across the life course of children could be a major strategy focus to reduce crime, but also then argue convincingly and based on the international literature, this is a strategy that's related to also other behavior problems and a range of physical and mental health problems in adolescence and early adulthood. I think of addressing domestic violence, and especially domestic violence during and after pregnancy, as one of the adversities that the child experiences before it is born and immediately after it is born. So in the period when it's most vulnerable in terms of brain and organism development. And so preventing domestic violence is a major strategy both to address violence against women, but also to give children a healthy start and break the transmission of violence that we have seen when we looked at the mother's experiences with violence, the transmission of violence across generations. I would like to end here with possible implications for research in Chile. And again, I would like to apologize to any of my colleagues here in the audience if I make suggestions here for research that is already underway. I did examine whether I could find publications, and I could find very limited publications on the topics that I am suggesting. I think, and I may be wrong, no current study has examined adverse childhood experiences and their association with adult outcomes in representative samples in Chile. I think there have been one or two studies on very high-risk samples. I believe that such a study could play a major role in mobilizing public action because it could underpin a broad prevention strategy across the life course and emphasize to policymakers the importance of focusing on multiple stresses across childhood in addressing crime, but also addressing other negative outcomes. I believe, but again, I'm not sure, there seems to be limited research on exposure to violence during and after pregnancy. So this is related, of course, to overall studies on domestic violence, where I know research has been done in Chile, but I don't think that there has been specific research on exposure to violence during and after pregnancy. And I believe that could be really useful and helpful to strengthen the prevention and response systems in primary care settings. I've been, one of the big parts of my work over the years have been longitudinal studies. I've done one longitudinal study in Switzerland, which has been going on for 20 years now. And as you could hear, I've just started another series of longitudinal studies in 8 different countries across the world. In my view, longitudinal studies are really important research bases to make the case for developmental prevention over the life course. And so I think efforts to establish a longitudinal study in Chile could really help to advance long-term early prevention efforts. And maybe if one did envisage such a study, one might want to link it to an early prevention program in order to examine the extent to which early interventions can address long-term negative consequences on children. Finally, I've tried to argue here that the months before and after birth offer opportunities for prevention that strengthen the family and the child. This is important here. In these months, women have a large number of contacts with health representatives. And this is a unique opportunity to intervene in sensible ways to strengthen the family and the child. Now, much of what is currently done in many countries is focused on making sure that the physical health of the mother and the child is guaranteed. But I believe there are a number of innovative prevention interventions that either focus on the mental health of the mother, the social context, or on intimate partner violence that could strengthen an integrated approach. And I think evaluation studies that focus on these kind of strategies could be very helpful to strengthen a healthy child development. So this was, I think, yes, my last slide, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Profesora Eisner, le tenemos que dar nosotros las gracias por esta interesante información, por esta inspiradora presentación. Durante su charla magistral hemos recibido distintas preguntas, pero como anfitriona quisiera yo hacer la primera, ¿no? Nuestra fundación desde el año 2007 trabaja en fortalecer el rol protector de los establecimientos educacionales a través del programa Paz Educa y actualmente el programa Convive, ¿no? Para prevenir la violencia y mejorar la gestión de la convivencia escolar. ¿Cuán relevante le parece este tipo de estrategias y en su experiencia, cuáles son los resultados más potentes? ¿Por qué debe haber una línea de política pública sostenida y sostenible en el tiempo para fortalecer el rol protectores, principalmente de plataformas que son distintas del sistema de justicia penal, ¿no? Como salud y educación?
I think that generally prevention and the activities of the criminal justice system must be seen by the side by side. One of the things I believe that is very clear these days is that if you want to effectively address levels of violence, you need to invest into effective prevention. These investments into effective prevention should not be seen exclusively as investments into preventing crime. I think that's a mistake. I think there are investments into healthy child development, because we know that so many risk factors associated with problematic developments of the child are risk factors that spread out into different types of behaviors. So strategies that aim, for instance, and I want to just mention a few things because you mentioned schools. Strategies that protect children from bullying victimization, which I haven't been talking about because I was focusing on the first years, but bullying victimization is such an important lasting factor that has a negative effect on child developing. Strengthening, for instance, children's ability to develop social skills in the school context is hugely important. But also, for instance, strategies that aim to improve the quality of schooling and reduce school exclusion or non-attendance in schools, in secondary school, is hugely important. So all these strategies must be put in place. At the moment, I believe one of the challenges that we have is that we can't put a precise figure behind the question, well, how much do you get out in terms of pesos or dollars out of a specific intervention strategy? There have been attempts to quantify these benefits, and I know this is useful for policymakers to have these cost-benefit ratios, but me personally, I'm cautious to come up with these figures because I think some of these figures are somewhat tentative, and I believe it's more important to make a moral case for supporting a healthy child development across all ages.
Sin duda. Nos preguntan también cuál es el nivel de importancia que tiene el apego en la etapa de infancia temprana para la prevención de la violencia y el delito, y qué acciones en su experiencia se debieran implementar desde el Estado con niñas, niños que se encuentran bajo su tutela. Son dos preguntas separadas. Una está relacionada con el nivel de apego, la primera, y la segunda, cuáles son estrategias efectivas para niños y niñas que están bajo la tutela del Estado.
Well, first of all, on the question of attachment, we have just published a paper that has been looking, based on the evidence for better lives data, at the link between exposure to intimate partner violence and adversities and prenatal attachment of the mother. So that's the extent to which the mother feels attached to her unborn child. And we could demonstrate in that study that there is quite a substantial association between experiencing adversities and a lack of ability, a reduced ability to attach to the unborn child. And we believe that this then in turn, in combination with issues related to mental health, depression, and stress of the mother, is then having a negative effect on child development. I'm not an attachment specialist, but I do believe that addressing these risk factors and adversities is one of the important bases for improving attachment between the mother and the child. Attachment, well, I'll leave it with this for the time being. Institutionalized children, I believe that, so I'm not a specialist on research for institutionalized children either. One of the things I think that is very clear from research, for instance, that has been done by Noemi Pereda in Barcelona, is that institutionalized children are at an extremely high risk of later delinquency, but also at an extremely high risk of victimization in many different forms. In many societies, one of the responses has been to try to minimize the number of children that are institutionalized. And certainly in the United Kingdom and in Switzerland, all the strategies are going in the direction of preferring foster care arrangements over institutionalization. Now, I don't feel, and I think I would like to leave it at this. I know that, for instance, in Spain, there is a much greater preference for institutionalizing children in childcare homes, and I've had these discussions. I don't feel competent to make a judgment of whether foster care arrangements or institutionalizations are the preferable strategy, but I do think that protecting those particularly vulnerable children from adversities is extremely, extremely important.
Sin duda, es un gran desafío, ya sea en sistema de foster care o de institucionalización de parte del Estado. ¿Cuál cree? Tenemos más preguntas, tenemos para 5 minutos más de preguntas. Si quieres, voy haciéndolas una a una. ¿Cuál crees que son las principales razones por las que los tomadores de decisiones debiesen pasar de una política criminal eminentemente disuasiva, que utiliza estrategias del sistema de justicia penal tradicional, hacia una política criminal con esta visión más integradora, ¿no? Que pone el foco y en el corazón del quehacer la prevención?
I'm just trying to think about how we have argued that case in different systems over the years. I believe that one of the important things to demonstrate to policymakers is that crime and offending, the kind of behaviors that you see in the criminal justice system, is only one age-specific manifestation of problem behaviors that have roots before contact with the criminal justice system starts. It starts in childhood, in early adolescence, long before the criminal justice system authorities are active. And I think demonstrating this to justice authorities helps to make a case for early prevention. I think it's also important to demonstrate to justice authorities that the costs that crime generates is so strongly associated with other costs to society, including unemployment, including mental health problems, and so on. And all these problems need to be examined, understood from an integrated perspective. I wanted to use this opportunity to say something about the harm index, which Daniel Johnson brought up, which I do believe I would not want to contradict Professor Sherman, who is a good colleague and friend of mine. But here is an interesting challenge when you think about the crime harm index. I do think it has a very important role in directing police activities towards the greatest harm. However, bearing in mind what I've been saying about adverse childhood experiences, children being beaten, children being neglected, children being victims of bullying, how do you quantify the harm of these experiences? And is it really so that you can calculate these harms by focusing on the severity of the punishment? This is not an argument against using the crime harm index, just to get me right. But I think that parallel to looking at crime harm in the sense of the amount of punishment for a certain crime, we also need to look at the social harm that is inflicted on the victims in terms of suffering. And it's not always quite clear to me whether these two really match each other.
No, sin duda. Además, en el caso de bullying, por ejemplo, no tiene una sanción penal que nos permita incorporar ese tipo de estimación. Por lo tanto, es un delito al que no le atribuiríamos, que no aparecería en ningún mapa, ¿no? Sin embargo, los efectos que tiene en el mediano y en el largo plazo en la vida de los individuos que lo sufren es muy dramático. Una última pregunta, profesor Eisner, nos hacen llegar respecto al estudio de Evidence for Better Lives. ¿Se podría hacer en Chile? ¿Y por qué el estudio está centrado en ciudades medianas y menos occidentalizadas, ¿no? ¿Qué particularidades tenían estas ciudades versus ciudades más occidentales?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, and first of all, you will have noticed, those of you who've looked at the map, that South America is a blank spot, which was not intended, I have to say. But these projects have their own histories, and we initially had a site in South America, not in Chile, but in Brazil. And then for a number of reasons that didn't materialize. So I think it would, well, we always wanted to have a site in South America. It's not happened for the foundational study, but if we can go on to the main study, it would be very interesting to have a site in South America. Why did we focus on low and middle income countries? The reason for this simply is that when it comes to the extent of experiencing violence across the world, there is one important imbalance, namely that low and middle income countries, whether you look at violence against women, violence against children, homicide, or whatever other manifestations of violence, also war, it overproportionally occurs in low and middle income countries. And that's the place where there is least research. And so that's why we focused on these places, because we thought that this is most important. The final reason is very simple. It's so much more costly to do a longitudinal study in a high income country. And so, although we always wanted to do this also in a high income country, and Chile would be one of them, the problem is that it just is so much more expensive to do this. It would be very interesting. I could come up with more reasons, but these are three of the main reasons for not doing it at the moment.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Esperamos poder retomar contacto para poder llevar a cabo un estudio tan interesante en nuestro país que ilumine nuestras políticas públicas para evitar estos importantes daños que se generan si es que llegamos tempranamente, ¿no? Hacemos vidas mucho mejores, ¿no? Y los impactos no solamente son finalmente en prevención de violencia y delitos, sino que en ciudadanas y ciudadanos más saludables, con una mejor vida. Ahora, profesor Eisner, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en nuestra sesión inaugural. Qué buena manera de iniciar estas 3 jornadas. Le mandamos un abrazo y a quienes nos están acompañando los invitamos a una pausa de 15 minutos para las próximas presentaciones. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en 15 minutos.
¿Ya?
Yes.
I hope. Thank you very much, Professor. Really interesting, your presentation.
Pleasure. Yeah, it was, thank you very much for inviting me. And that's very interesting. Yeah, it would have, of course, have been nice to come over to Chile. I always have been planning to come to Chile. But I'm sure there is going to be another time to meet you in person.
Yes.
Okay.
Perdón, no sé si estaba silenciado. ¿Se escucha ahí?
Yes, I can hear you.
Ah, perfecto. Bien, no, decirle que no, I don't know, I prefer in Spanish, but I don't know if you can understand
Sí,
me.
puede hablar en español.
Perfecto, profesor, mucho mejor para mí. Si I don't know why, but
Silenciaron.
yes,
Daniel,
se silencia. Ahora
¿tuviste
estoy aquí, pero se silencia el micrófono. Pero ahí se está escuchando,
Daniel,
parece.
la sesión está aún online y se está transmitiendo en YouTube, entonces para que los participantes no se confundan y puedan ir a la pausa, los expositores debemos dejar nuestras cámaras y silenciar nuestros audios.
Ah, perfecto. Bien. Ok.
Bienvenidos nuevamente a la 12ª Conferencia Internacional, Desafíos para la Seguridad de nuestras ciudades, Gestión de Territorios para la Prevención del Delito y la Violencia. Para seguir con nuestro programa, quiero ahora presentarles un espacio que para nosotros es de suma importancia, ya que es parte de la energía que nos mueve día a día y que proyectamos a través de esta iniciativa. Se trata del 10º concurso internacional sobre iniciativas prometedoras y buenas prácticas en gestión de información en seguridad ciudadana, organizado por Fundación Paz Ciudadana y que cuenta con el apoyo de Motorola Solutions Foundation. Este año buscamos apoyar iniciativas que contribuyeran principalmente a mejorar la comprensión del fenómeno de la violencia y el delito, promover herramientas que contribuyan a mejorar la gestión de las instituciones del sistema de seguridad y justicia y finalmente contribuir a la solución de problemas vinculados al fenómeno de la violencia. Durante esta mañana daremos a conocer en detalle 2 destacadas iniciativas. Los dejo con la primera de ellas, que proviene de Colombia, que se titula Índice de Temor Ciudadano, desarrollado por el Sistema de Información para la Seguridad y la Convivencia, SISC, de la Alcaldía de Medellín. Bienvenidos a Jessica Salazar, que es economista y magíster en matemáticas aplicadas, analista de gestión del conocimiento del Sistema de Información para la Seguridad y la Convivencia, y a Sebastián Emilio Henao, economía y estudiante de la maestría en estudios socioespaciales, analista cualitativo del Sistema de Información para la Seguridad y la Convivencia, SISC, de la Alcaldía de Medellín. Sean muy bienvenidos entonces, Jessica y Emilio.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Voy a compartir pantalla.
Perfecto.
Listo, me confirman por favor si están viendo la pantalla.
Vemos perfecto tu presentación, Emilio.
Excelente. Buenos días para todos y todas. Como nos decía Gail de Paz Ciudadana, nosotros somos Jessica Salazar Vázquez y Sebastián Emilio Henao, analistas del Sistema de Información para la Seguridad y la Convivencia. Hoy vamos a presentar un estudio, una aplicación metodológica en la que hemos venido trabajando. Este es un producto todavía en desarrollo. Es un índice de temor ciudadano, una propuesta de una forma distinta de acercarse a la medición de la seguridad y la convivencia, una forma de medir el miedo en la ciudad. El sistema de información para la seguridad y la convivencia es un sistema de información adscrito a la alcaldía de Medellín. Medellín es la capital del departamento de Antioquia, que es un departamento de Colombia. El CISC es el resultado de más de una década de búsqueda por consolidar un sistema oficial de información sobre seguridad y convivencia en Medellín. Nosotros nos encargamos de hacerle un seguimiento al comportamiento espaciotemporal de los principales indicadores de seguridad y convivencia. Esto con el fin de respaldar con evidencia las decisiones de política pública. El CISC es una pieza clave también en la articulación con otros niveles de gobierno, otras ramas del poder público, la academia y la sociedad civil con respecto a la transmisión y la gestión del conocimiento. Y no sobra decir que por 5º año consecutivo tenemos la oportunidad de presentar nuestras buenas prácticas en la conferencia de Paz Ciudadana. Hoy les traemos un índice de temor ciudadano que surge con esta pregunta. Con esta cuestión. Medellín históricamente en las últimas décadas ha sido conocida a nivel nacional y a nivel internacional como una de las ciudades más violentas del país y más violentas del mundo, para distintos tipos de violencia, como homicidios, desplazamientos forzados, desapariciones, hurto en todas sus modalidades y muchas otras más. Sin embargo, en los últimos años se ha registrado una reducción paulatina en este nivel de delictividad. No obstante, nosotros con una encuesta de percepción de victimización de seguridad y convivencia, observamos que el nivel de inseguridad que sienten las personas en la ciudad se mantiene constante a través del tiempo. No importa si el delito aumenta o disminuye, esta percepción de inseguridad se mantiene constante. Aquí vemos la evolución de la consideración de inseguridad a nivel de barrio, que es la unidad la menor unidad político-administrativa, seguido de las comunas, que es un conjunto de barrios, y la ciudad, que hace referencia a la unión de sus comunas y corregimientos. Vemos que para 2014, el 11% de las personas se sentían inseguras o muy inseguras en sus barrios. Este nivel se mantiene constante hasta 2019. Con respecto a la comuna, el 16% en promedio, con una disminución al 14% en 2019, de las personas se sentían inseguras. Y para el nivel de Medellín pasamos de un 44% de personas que se sentían inseguras o muy inseguras en la ciudad a un 50%. Esto nos quiere decir que 1 de cada 2 personas se sienten inseguras en Medellín. Como vemos, esta percepción de la seguridad es mayor a medida que ampliamos la escala territorial considerada. Las personas se sienten seguras en sus barrios, un poco menos seguras en sus comunas, y en la ciudad podemos decir que se sienten inseguras. Cuando consideramos que ha habido una disminución del delito y la disminución de percepción de seguridad no va en la misma proporción, ¿qué decimos nosotros? Bueno, hay elementos subjetivos de la seguridad, hay elementos no observables que las denuncias y estos indicadores como las tasas, como la ocurrencia de hechos no capturan. También hay factores que escapan a los indicadores, como las condiciones físicas del espacio, las condiciones ambientales del espacio. Y nos encontramos con otro hecho muy significativo, que es la cifra oculta del delito. Sí, la tasa de delitos ha venido disminuyendo con relativos aumentos, pero en general la tendencia es a la baja. Sin embargo, en 2019, por ejemplo, el hurto a personas no fue denunciado por el 57% de las víctimas, el hurto a residencia por el 77%, el hurto de vehículos por el 57%, las riñas por el 79% y la extorsión por el 86%. Entonces, en el mejor de los casos, la mitad de la gente no denunció un delito, y en el peor de los casos, aproximadamente 9 de cada 10 personas no denunció un delito. Esto nos llevó a considerar que es necesario tener otros indicadores, en este caso el temor, que sirvan como una categoría de análisis que se encuentre al nivel de la seguridad observable y de la convivencia. Entonces, con este fin nos acercamos a una medición del temor que nos permita georreferenciarlo y posteriormente identificar cuáles son sus determinantes en el territorio. Entonces, el objetivo general que guió esta investigación fue implementar un marco metodológico que permitiera identificar, georreferenciar lo que ya les mencionaba, el temor ciudadano. Esto con el fin de complementar y fortalecer los indicadores que ya existen actualmente sobre seguridad y convivencia. Las etapas del proceso hasta el momento han sido 4. En primer lugar, se realizó una exploración de literatura referente al temor al delito, al temor a la ciudad. Aquí vemos que los principales referentes, hay muchos otros, yo voy a resaltar los que guiaron este proceso, son principalmente Delemú con El miedo en Occidente. Delemú hace una historia aproximadamente de la Edad Media, de aquellos factores culturales, simbólicos y subjetivos que han guiado el miedo en Occidente. Podemos resaltar los callejones cerrados, la oscuridad, la incertidumbre, los caminos desolados entre aldea y aldea, entre muchos otros. Delemú como editor publicó en Colombia un libro donde se hace una consideración del temor al delito desde varias ciencias sociales. Se hace un abordaje desde la ciencia política, desde la antropología, desde la sociología, que a nuestro parecer es muy completo en términos teóricos. Está Kessler 2009 con el temor al delito. Kessler creo que es uno de los referentes más importantes a nivel latinoamericano, ¿no? Y a nivel mundial también con respecto a esa diferenciación necesaria que hay que hacer entre la inseguridad y el temor al delito. Es uno de los primeros que nosotros observamos que no solo lo desagregan, sino que ofrecen alguna estrategia para permitir su medición a través de encuestas y a través de otras estrategias. Está Acevedo 2008, quien hace un estudio sobre los determinantes socioeconómicos del temor al delito. Pinker 2018, con su libro Los ángeles que llevamos dentro, que nos muestran que el siglo XXI es quizás el siglo con los menores niveles de violencia física en toda la historia reciente de la humanidad, por lo menos los últimos 2000 años. nos generó la duda, bueno, si estamos en los niveles más bajos de violencia, ¿por qué estamos en niveles tan altos de temor delictivo? ¿Cierto? Peña 2017, que nos muestra cómo la gente incorpora este temor a la ciudad en las decisiones racionales que realiza cotidianamente. Cómo el temor a la ciudad crea estrategias de securitización que permite recorrer territorios, resignificar espacios de temor y espacios de esperanza, y cómo incorporar estas estrategias a su cotidianidad. Quinteros et al. Nos hace una aproximación a formas de medir esta violencia subjetiva, y finalmente Paz Ciudadana, que hace una aproximación o establece un índice de medición del temor en la ciudad. A partir de esta exploración literaria, de esta exploración de literatura, nosotros seleccionamos variables de una encuesta de percepción de seguridad y convivencia que venimos realizando desde 2014. Estas variables posteriormente las simplificamos, las convertimos, las indizamos. Más adelante les explicaremos el proceso. También recolectamos información delictiva y socioeconómica a nivel de barrio y manzana, y con estas variables, apoyados en la literatura que ya les mencioné, estimamos un modelo de econometría que nos permitió identificar y georreferenciar algunos determinantes del temor ciudadano. Los dejo con mi compañera Jessica.
Muchas gracias, Emilio, y a todos por la invitación. Quiero confirmar si me están escuchando.
Te escuchamos perfecto, Jessica.
Muchísimas gracias. Bueno, para este ejercicio nosotros hicimos o diseñamos un marco metodológico que nos permitiera coger desde la revisión de literatura, desde los instrumentos de la encuesta y desde otro tipo de información que nosotros podemos usar desde la alcaldía y desde la secretaría para hacer la estimación y encontrar cómo es el temor ciudadano actualmente en Medellín y cuáles aspectos influyen más en que las personas sientan miedo o tengan una percepción de seguridad o de inseguridad alta. Entonces, para eso, lo primero que hicimos fue hacer la revisión de literatura, que ya mi compañero Emilio la contó muy bien. Este fue el insumo para saber qué variables podíamos tener en cuenta. Luego de eso, nosotros cogimos la encuesta de percepción de seguridad, analizamos una a una las preguntas y redujimos toda la opción de preguntas a cuáles son esas preguntas claves que nos van a decir la percepción de seguridad en la ciudad, integrando la ciudad, la comuna y el barrio, puede dar un resultado global. Entonces lo que hicimos fue seleccionar cada uno de los capítulos de la encuesta, hacer una revisión paralelamente de los datos, porque también teníamos un registro de algunas de las variables, y teniendo en cuenta aquellas variables de la encuesta que tuvieran un alto porcentaje de respuesta, y teniendo en cuenta aquellas preguntas que desde la revisión de la literatura nos podían servir para medir la percepción de seguridad en la ciudad. Entonces seleccionamos unas variables que son 3 variables para medir el temor ciudadano. Para eso, lo que hicimos fue organizar la información a nivel de individuo y con respecto a cada individuo, entonces organizamos una base de datos que tuviera información a nivel de persona encuestada. Adicionalmente, entonces también nos preparamos con alguna información que tenemos de la ciudad. Entonces analizamos datos de delitos, datos de información del censo que nos dieran, nos mostrara cómo estaba distribuida la población en la ciudad, y lo que hicimos con ella fue tenerla en cuenta para darle o agregarle información a cada una de las personas. Entonces, ¿acá qué hicimos? Acá cogimos información de diferentes delitos, la agregamos y calculamos las frecuencias de cada uno de los delitos por una unidad de análisis, en este caso que fue los polígonos de barrio, o sea que tuvimos en cuenta la información barrial para agregar tanto información de delitos como información poblacional y poder usar estas estadísticas o estas frecuencias agregadas de barrio para agregárselas a cada una de las personas encuestadas, y el criterio para agregarle esta información a las personas encuestadas era el lugar de residencia de estas personas. Entonces, lo primero que hicimos fue construir a partir de los datos de la encuesta de percepción de seguridad el índice de temor ciudadano. Para eso sabíamos que queríamos saber cómo es la percepción del ciudadano respecto a su barrio, respecto a su comuna y respecto a su ciudad, para construir finalmente el índice. Posteriormente, lo que hicimos fue generar una variable dicotómica o una dummy, donde 1 significa que el resultado del índice dio inseguro, 0 quiere decir que dio seguro para cada uno de esos encuestados, y finalmente estimamos un modelo de clasificación, el más clásico, que es el PROVIT, y ya a partir de ahí estimamos o podemos observar en los resultados cuáles son las probabilidades de temor ciudadano de acuerdo a la densidad poblacional, de acuerdo a la misma percepción o los cambios en percepción y de acuerdo a la agrupación de los delitos. Siguiente, por favor. Bueno, en la implementación del índice de temor ciudadano, lo que hicimos fue generar diferentes medidas de índice. Entonces, ¿qué preguntas tuvimos en cuenta? Las que ven en pantalla a mano izquierda. La primera, en general, en su barrio usted se siente, y las opciones de respuesta son entre seguro y muy inseguro. La otra fue, en general, en su comuna o corregimiento usted se siente, está en la misma escala, y en general en Medellín, o sea, en la ciudad, usted se siente también en escala entre seguro y muy inseguro. Entonces nosotros realizamos 3 medidas de temor ciudadano. La primera de ellas era la más sencilla, que fue, hicimos un promedio simple. La segunda, ya realizamos un promedio ponderado. Y la tercera, realizamos Support Vector Machine para reducción de dimensionalidad. Y lo que hicimos fue, tenemos esta información a nivel de persona, es decir, aún no la teníamos geocodificada. Entonces lo que hicimos fue tomar una decisión, porque en este punto la encuesta tiene significancia estadística a nivel de comuna y nosotros queríamos mostrar una desagregación más pequeña. Entonces lo que hicimos fue agrupar barrios de la ciudad para poder agrupar significancia estadística y poder mostrar un resultado general en esa unidad espacial agregada, que no es a nivel de barrios, sino que es a nivel de un cúmulo de barrios. Y lo que hicimos fue poner estos 3 resultados en un formulario, y tuvimos la participación de algunos expertos que conocen la ciudad y que sabían dónde hay mayor sentimiento de temor en la ciudad. Entonces, después de realizar ese ejercicio y contando que es una medida de agregación, o sea, que el resultado es a nivel de persona, pero que lo que buscábamos era de alguna manera focalizar esos puntos muy inseguros para poderlos identificar y poder validar el ejercicio. Y de ese resultado, entonces, con la opinión de los expertos, el resultado del índice de temor es el que está encerrado en rojo, y con ese índice de temor fue que procedimos a continuar la estimación del modelo. Siguiente, por favor. Bueno, entonces, de esos resultados de ese índice, teníamos 3.909 personas encuestadas, cuyo promedio era 3.46, cercano a 4 quiere decir que la persona se siente segura, cercano a 1 quiere decir que se siente insegura. Entonces, en estadísticas generales, la gente tiende a sentirse segura en la ciudad de Medellín. ¿Por qué? Porque si tenemos en cuenta la mediana que es acá, donde aparece el 50%, está muy cerca a 4, y eso quiere decir que la gente en general se siente segura. Entonces, ¿nosotros qué hicimos? Cogimos información de delitos, que en este caso fueron hurto a personas, homicidios y lesiones, y las agrupamos para tener una sola variable que nos mostrara los delitos. Este es el resultado, pero nosotros lo que hicimos fue simular, teniendo las frecuencias de diferentes delitos y agrupándolas para tenerlas acá como una variable explicativa que fuera la frecuencia de hechos delictivos. Y cogimos información del censo, que en este caso lo que hicimos fue no tener en cuenta la densidad poblacional de todo el barrio, sino que tuvimos en cuenta la densidad de la población respecto a las viviendas, es decir, donde hay muchas viviendas, de pronto las casas son más pequeñas, o puede haber más, o puede haber posibilidades de hacinamiento, mientras que cuando mejora de pronto digamos, la distribución en el espacio, quiere decir personas que de pronto tienen mejores condiciones socioeconómicas, es decir, tienden a ser, pero en donde hay menor densidad poblacional respecto a las viviendas, tienden a ser casas más grandes y personas de estratos socioeconómicos o de niveles de ingresos mayores. Y a esto voy un poco porque en la exploración espacial que teníamos en los mapas anteriores que les mostrábamos, donde hay mayor percepción de inseguridad. Emi, por favor, nos devolvemos un segundito, que esto vale la pena mencionarlo. Donde hay mejor percepción de seguridad, que es en los puntos amarillos, son estratos socioeconómicos o niveles de ingresos más bajos, mientras que donde hay mayor percepción de inseguridad tienden a ser estratos socioeconómicos más altos. Entonces, esto nos pareció un hallazgo chévere, porque entonces quiere decir las personas donde tienen mejores condiciones económicas tienden a tener mayor percepción de inseguridad, mientras que donde hay ingresos socioeconómicos más bajitos, la gente tiende a sentirse más segura en su barrio y en su ciudad. Otra vez, siguiente, por favor. Listo. Entonces, tuvimos en cuenta hechos delictivos del barrio que se le atribuyeron a cada uno de los encuestados. Densidad poblacional por vivienda que se calculó también por barrio y se atribuyó a cada uno de los encuestados. Y tuvimos en cuenta algunas variables que también eran importantes tener en consideración después de la revisión de literatura, y es esa mejora en percepción. Es decir, no la percepción actual, sino cómo ha mejorado respecto al año anterior o a la medición anterior. Entonces, en este caso, la mejora de percepción, tuvimos en cuenta la mejora de percepción en el barrio, en la comuna y en la ciudad. Y encontramos que en este caso la variable dependiente es 1 y 0. 1 significa inseguro, 0 significa seguro, y de esa forma, entonces vamos a leer los coeficientes que son el cuadro rojo a la izquierda. Entonces hay una mayor probabilidad de reducción de la percepción de inseguridad cuando hay una mejoría respecto al barrio en comparación que a la comuna y en comparación que a la ciudad. Es decir, si nosotros queremos mejorar la percepción de seguridad, tendríamos que primero generar mayor percepción de seguridad o mejorar las condiciones de percepción de seguridad en toda la ciudad, más que en la comuna y más que en el barrio. Y con relación a la frecuencia de los hechos delictivos, entonces ahí sí es directa, y en este caso de una vez muestra que cuando hay un aumento en hechos delictivos, aumenta la percepción de inseguridad. Es decir, tendríamos, pues es algo directo, hay un hurto, hay un homicidio, hay una lesión, y en general hay hechos delictivos en la ciudad que aportan directamente a que las personas sientan miedo, y que esto sería, pues nosotros lo que hicimos fue iterar entre diferentes delitos, y estos fueron como los de mayor impacto que tuvimos en la medición, y sería como, bueno, estos son los delitos que más aportan a que la gente se sienta insegura. Entonces, si queremos mejorar la percepción de seguridad en la ciudad, entonces ataquemos o hagamos algunas recomendaciones para que los hacedores de política en el territorio ataquen directamente en la reducción de estos delitos, que son hurto a personas, homicidios y lesiones. Y la densidad de población por vivienda también, cuando los barrios también disminuye la percepción de seguridad. O sea, cuando los barrios son muy poblados, tiende a tener mayor percepción de inseguridad. Siguiente. Bueno, con respecto a la encuesta, pues la encuesta es un insumo que hemos venido teniendo desde 2014, como nos contó Emilio al principio de la exposición. Es una encuesta que se hace año a año, que se arrojan resultados año a año en relación a percepción de inseguridad o de seguridad, y a victimización. Año a año se calcula el índice de victimización en la ciudad. Nosotros este año usamos esta encuesta como insumo, pero nos dimos cuenta que el alcance espacial o la desagregación para encontrar significancia estadística es muy alto. Entonces, dentro de uno de los principales retos es poder tener la encuesta con un mejor alcance y poder lograr significancia estadística a nivel de barrio en vez de a nivel de comuna. Y como retos futuros, encontrar otros determinantes que nos permitan mejorar la percepción de seguridad basado en otro tipo de atributos, ya sean educativos, culturales, otros atributos que puedan contribuir a que la población en Medellín y en general en las ciudades similares a Medellín se sientan más seguros.
Sí, muchas gracias. Por último, las implicaciones que tiene estos tipos de índice de temor en la política pública. Sabemos que, y como nos mostró Jessy, el temor ciudadano es un indicador subjetivo, pero arraigado en elementos objetivos. Algunos de estos, como ya los mencionaba ella, eran los referentes territoriales. A medida que nos alejamos del territorio más conocido, nos encontramos con un mayor sentimiento de inseguridad. también incide el nivel delictivo y las condiciones socioeconómicas y la infraestructura física. Por lo tanto, este índice o este tipo de mediciones sirve para dar cuenta de un alto número de victimizaciones y vulnerabilidades que sufre la ciudadanía y que escapan a los indicadores cuantitativos que usualmente son usados para medir el delito, las tasas de homicidio, los niveles de hurto, etc. Dado que el temor ciudadano produce espacios estigmatizados y proclives, y los espacios estigmatizados tienden a ser proclives al delito, es necesario entonces en estos espacios que se focalicen, complementar las inversiones que se establecen actualmente en reducción del delito con otras que apunten a la disminución del temor ciudadano, a la reconversión de estos espacios y que permitan, siguiendo a Gildo y Lefebvre, un ejercicio efectivo del derecho a la ciudad. Por último, una de las principales indicadores con los que la ciudadanía mide la gestión de los gobiernos es el sentimiento de inseguridad. En todas las encuestas ciudadanas, en todas las ciudades, en todos los países, encontramos que la inseguridad es uno de los principales indicadores que preocupa a la ciudadanía. Por lo tanto, estrategias que lleven a una efectiva reducción de los niveles de inseguridad, pero también de los niveles de temor, llevarán necesariamente a un mayor nivel de confianza institucional y a un mayor nivel de aprobación ciudadana. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jessica y Emilio, por dar a conocer tan interesante iniciativa. Felicitaciones al CISC y a todo su equipo por su búsqueda constante en realizar investigaciones y estudios que permitan avanzar en la generación de conocimiento para que nuestros barrios y ciudades sean más seguros. Ahora, y para finalizar este segmento, les presento a Brenda Belleza Ancaya, que es gerente del Observatorio de Criminalidad del Ministerio Público del Perú, quien nos presentará el modelo de gestión del conocimiento en violencia sexual contra niños, niñas y adolescentes, identificación, prevención, persecución y protección. Muchas gracias y bienvenida, Brenda, esta mañana.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos y a todas. A nombre del Ministerio Público del Perú, deseo felicitar la importante iniciativa de Fundación Paz Ciudadana, que cada año promueve la presentación de estas importantes experiencias. Y bueno, también agradecemos la oportunidad de poder participar en esta ocasión en la 12ª Conferencia Internacional para Ciudades y Barrios Más Seguros, para compartir con ustedes esta buena práctica que, tal como lo mencionas, está denominada Modelo de Gestión del Conocimiento en violencia sexual contra niños, niñas y adolescentes, identificación, prevención, persecución y protección. Voy a pasar, por favor, a presentarles las diapositivas. Por favor, les agradecería mucho que puedan confirmarme que están visualizándola.
Vemos tu presentación.
Ok, listo, muchas gracias. Bueno, esta presentación ha sido elaborada conjuntamente con 5 profesionales del Observatorio de Criminalidad, señor Juan Wambachano, la señora Rosa Guanes, Jessica Acevedo y Felipe Díaz. Es un equipo multidisciplinario que viene trabajando varios años en el observatorio y que se ha abocado específicamente a la gestión de información. A modo general, les comentaré entonces que el Ministerio Público del Perú es un organismo constitucionalmente autónomo que se encuentra integrado al proceso de administración de justicia y tiene como misión defender la legalidad y los intereses públicos tutelados por la ley, prevenir y perseguir el delito, representando a la sociedad y a la ciudadanía en juicio de manera eficaz y oportuna, ¿no? Como domicilio y sede principal nos encontramos en la ciudad de Lima. Y bueno, dentro de su organización tenemos 3 niveles: el nivel fiscal, el nivel administrativo y el nivel médico-legal, los mismos que se encuentran involucrados en esta experiencia. En cuanto a su cobertura, tiene una cobertura nacional, y sobre sus lineamientos de política vamos a señalar aquellos que se relacionan específicamente con la práctica que vamos a presentar el día de hoy, los mismos que son fortalecer la lucha contra la delincuencia e impunidad a través de la actuación fiscal eficiente y oportuna, el impulso de la lucha contra la violencia y la desigualdad de género, y la promoción de prevención del delito. Y bueno, ¿qué es lo que nos motivó a hacer esta práctica? Comentarles que el Ministerio Público entre el 2016 y 2019 ha registrado 25.984 delitos denunciados a nivel nacional por violación sexual de menores de edad, tocamientos, actos de connotación sexual, actos libidinosos en agravio de menores, lo que presenta una tasa de crecimiento anual de 16,7%. Este crecimiento habría disminuido en el año 2020, año en que se declaró la emergencia sanitaria a consecuencia del COVID-19, lo que también nos ha fijado mucha preocupación respecto de esta problemática, ¿no? Asimismo, tomando como referencia un estudio desarrollado por el investigador Haris Mujica, sabemos que en el Perú la tendencia de hechos declarados por violencia sexual, en los casos que se han registrado por las instituciones de justicia, existe una campana en donde el umbral de apertura inicia entre los 10 y 11 años y tiene un pico entre los 16 y 17 años. La misma que comienza ya a cerrarse entre los 18 y 21 años de edad. Además, también otro estudio realizado por el mismo investigador señala que al estar asociados a una secuencia de victimización y a un mismo agresor, una parte de las violaciones podrían ser evitadas detectando los primeros hechos de violencia y controlando esta violencia antes o al inicio del umbral de la campana de victimización. Este dato es sumamente importante considerando que la problemática de violencia sexual se caracteriza por dos hechos fundamentales, ¿no? Que es la falta de denuncia y el subregistro. Y en esta línea conocemos por diferentes estudios que en América Latina y el Caribe, al menos solamente el 5% de las víctimas denuncian ante las instituciones de justicia. Es decir, de 100 casos que podrían registrarse, al menos 95 no se estarían presentando denuncias, ¿no? Entonces, esta data para nosotros significó mucho, digamos, para la elaboración de esta práctica. Es así que, digamos, como parte de las instituciones que conforman el Estado peruano, que han desarrollado diversas acciones en los últimos años para reducir la prevalencia de este delito, como observatorio decidimos aportar a través de la gestión de información con este grupo vulnerable, ¿cómo no? Desarrollando un modelo de gestión básicamente que nos permita a partir del análisis criminal desarrollar una propuesta que integre diferentes ámbitos de atención, ¿no? En ese contexto es que se desarrolló un modelo que tenía como objetivo general contribuir a la reducción de violencia sexual en agravio de niños, niñas y adolescentes en el Perú a través del diseño de un servicio sostenido de articulación efectiva de las unidades de organización del Ministerio Público involucradas, tal como les señalaba al inicio, ¿no? El sistema fiscal, el sistema médico-legal y el sistema administrativo, así como las instituciones del sistema de justicia y protección social que también nos acompañan en esta labor, ¿no? Y bueno, para lograr este objetivo, desarrollamos 5 objetivos específicos. El primero, que es la identificación y evaluación del nivel de riesgo de las víctimas y las potenciales víctimas. El segundo, que está orientado a diseñar servicios de acompañamiento y asistencia a favor de estas víctimas o potenciales víctimas. Y el tercero es diseñar servicios de evaluación y protección a favor de las potenciales víctimas. El cuarto, monitorear y promover la eficacia y celeridad de las investigaciones. Y finalmente, el quinto objetivo específico sería sensibilizar a la ciudadanía para la identificación y también para la denuncia de estos casos que ya sabemos son un problema importante en esta problemática. En ese sentido, esta iniciativa promueve el desarrollo de políticas basadas en un modelo de gestión del conocimiento, ¿no? Este modelo de gestión apunta o parte, mejor dicho, del análisis de la problemática que es la violación sexual, focalizando, digamos, la población potencialmente vulnerable, aquella que es prioritaria en el sistema para la atención, para luego con ello realizar un análisis estratégico, ¿no? Que permita la identificación de los escenarios donde se dan estos casos en el ámbito nacional, cuál es la tendencia del delito, y bueno, con ello pues permitir la planificación de acciones a largo plazo, acciones estratégicas, acciones prioritarias, institucionalizar instrumentos para la gestión de esta información, entre otros, ¿no? Para luego pasar ya al análisis táctico, ¿no? Que representa pues la identificación, examen de patrones, series temporales que nos permitan generar alertas y reportes para una acción inmediata en este tipo de casos, ¿no? Es así que ante la hipótesis que la identificación temprana de los indicadores de abuso sexual infantil nos permitirían desplegar acciones para evitar la victimización múltiple, para garantizar el acceso a las víctimas a los servicios de justicia y también pues para evitar la impunidad, es que hemos desarrollado esta práctica, ¿no? La misma que tendría un alcance nacional a través de los sistemas que vienen operando en el Ministerio Público, comprendería un horizonte temporal de 5 años y que pues estaría dirigido principalmente en una primera etapa a una población de 5.846 niños, niñas y adolescentes. Este cálculo se habría realizado sobre la base de la información que tenemos de las denuncias registradas hasta la fecha. Y bueno, pues para comentarles un poco más de esta iniciativa, es necesario señalar que comprende 4 actividades principales, ¿no? La primera, que es la identificación y evaluación de las niñas víctimas y de las potenciales víctimas, tal como lo habíamos señalado y concordante con los objetivos específicos, ¿no? Lo segundo, que es el diseño de servicios de acompañamiento y asistencia. Lo tercero, que es el diseño de servicios de evaluación y protección a favor de los niños y niñas en riesgo de ser víctimas de violencia sexual. Y lo cuarto, que hemos considerado a modo transversal y que es prioritario para el desarrollo de este trabajo, es el fortalecimiento de capacidades del personal fiscal y médico legal que estaría involucrado en estos procesos y que permitiría dar impulso a las investigaciones fiscales, brindando pues eficacia y celeridad en las mismas, ¿no? En ese sentido, la implementación de esta iniciativa considera 6 productos específicos, ¿no? Estos 6 productos principalmente son el desarrollar un instrumento de evaluación de indicadores de violencia sexual, que lo vamos a pasar a ver más adelante. El segundo, que sería pues desarrollar un aplicativo móvil para la aplicación de este instrumento. El tercero, que sería poder identificar a víctimas y a potenciales víctimas. El cuarto, que sería desarrollar un protocolo interinstitucional de acompañamiento, evaluación, asistencia y protección que pueda ser implementado y difundido a los operadores involucrados en el sistema de justicia. El quinto producto sería pues contar o realizar el acompañamiento, evaluación, asistencia y protección de las víctimas y potenciales víctimas beneficiadas. Y finalmente, pues, tener a nuestro personal fiscal y médico legal capacitado, que como sabemos es de suma importancia en este proceso, ¿no? Ahora, a modo preliminar les comento que esta práctica, esta iniciativa se encuentra ahora iniciando su proceso de implementación. Este proceso de implementación involucra que se haya desarrollado un instrumento pictórico con tecnologías emergentes, el mismo que venimos desarrollando con el PRONAVEC, que es el Programa Nacional de Becas y Crédito Educativo del Perú. Este programa, pues, como saben, es un programa de becas y créditos que se brinda a diferentes estudiantes que, bueno, desarrollan procesos de especialización fuera del país y que luego, al culminar, tienen un proceso de retorno al Estado peruano brindando un servicio. Y este servicio nosotros lo hemos canalizado específicamente para que puedan apoyarnos en el desarrollo del instrumento pictórico y a través de la conformación de un equipo multidisciplinario podemos ya, digamos, contar con este instrumento, el mismo que es de suma importancia para la identificación de víctimas y posibles víctimas en este proceso, ¿no? En ese sentido, bueno, vamos a pasar a comentarles algunos de los resultados intermedios. El primero que es identificar a niños, niñas y adolescentes víctimas y en riesgo de ser víctimas. El segundo, pues, que sería la evaluación de un nivel de riesgo de niños, niñas, adolescentes víctimas y en riesgo de ser víctimas. El tercero, que es el diseño de servicios integrales de acompañamiento y asistencia a favor de los niños, niñas y adolescentes. Lo cuarto sería, pues, consensuar y diseñar una estrategia integral de evaluación y protección. El quinto, la mejora de la eficacia y de la celeridad de las investigaciones fiscales. Y el sexto, pues, sería difundir a la ciudadanía información sobre los indicios y mecanismos y canales de denuncia que existen para poder acercarlos también a que puedan denunciar estos hechos que vienen siendo, pues, dados en diferentes espacios, ¿no? Ahora, bueno, pues les presento algunas capturas de pantalla. Este es nuestro instrumento pictórico, el mismo que viene siendo desarrollado por los profesionales del PRONAVEC, que ya les comentaba, en articulación con el Observatorio de Criminalidad del Ministerio Público. El mismo que ya se encontraría en etapa de implementación, ¿no? Ahora, a modo, digamos, de concluir con esta experiencia, con este proyecto, nosotros miramos 4 resultados finales, ¿no? Estos resultados finales estarían orientados principalmente a incrementar la denuncia de delitos de violación sexual de menor de edad y de tocamientos, que ya sabemos que es, digamos, el principal problema en este análisis de información que hemos realizado. Deseamos incorporar a los niños, niñas y adolescentes identificados como personas en riesgo en una estrategia integral de evaluación y protección que involucra diferentes instancias del Ministerio Público. Deseamos disminuir el tiempo promedio de la investigación fiscal de los casos calificados jurídicamente como delitos de los que hemos señalado y que estén involucrados en este proceso. Incrementar también el número de sentencias condenatorias respecto a las investigaciones calificadas por los delitos señalados, ¿no? Y bueno, en relación a este proceso, tenemos diferentes aprendizajes, pero vamos a pasar a presentar algunos de ellos, ¿no? Lo primero es que, tal como lo habíamos señalado, pues estas situaciones de abuso sexual, de tocamientos, de actos contra el poder son detectados en diferentes espacios. Uno de ellos es el hogar. Entonces, al aplicar estos instrumentos pictóricos, este instrumento pictórico, perdón, es necesario, pues, realizar acciones de consentimiento, ¿no? Y para ello hay que comunicar a los padres, a los tutores, sobre cuál sería la finalidad de poder aplicar este instrumento. Y ante ello hemos encontrado resistencia en diferentes espacios para poder aceptar o suscribir el consentimiento informado para la aplicación de este instrumento a niños, niñas y adolescentes. Entonces allí tendríamos un primer obstáculo para la identificación, para este proceso de diagnóstico. Lo segundo es que existe desconocimiento de algunos operadores que estarían, digamos, bajo la responsabilidad de los niños, niñas y adolescentes a los que se les brindaría esta aplicación sobre el uso de herramientas tecnológicas. Si bien ahora con la emergencia sanitaria y con digamos, con el cambio que ha habido en la educación, en el uso de tecnologías, hemos logrado brindar un acercamiento al respecto, aún encontramos muchas limitaciones para poder acceder, digamos, al uso de tecnología, sobre todo en el ámbito nacional, ¿no? Considerando, pues, de que hay que realizar también procesos de inducción, de asistencia para que puedan aprender a utilizarlos, para que puedan aprender también a compartirlos con los niños, niños y adolescentes en algunos casos, ¿no? Y también otro importante obstáculo es la sobrecarga procesal en los despachos fiscales, ¿no? Lo mismo que limita la celeridad de las investigaciones, pese a que, digamos, existe, o sabemos o conocemos que existe una gran cifra oculta, el número de investigaciones, de denuncias que se aperturan por este tipo de casos continúa siendo importante. Y pues para el desarrollo de estas acciones hay que desarrollar procesos a nivel del Instituto de Medicina Legal, hay que desarrollar pericias, hay que desarrollar diferentes acciones que involucran también, pues, una sobrecarga en algunos casos para algunos despachos, y eso también pues limita el desarrollo de investigaciones, ¿no? Y bueno, en lo que corresponde a los aprendizajes, sabemos pues de que el proceso desarrollado con los profesionales del PRONAVEC ha sido un importante paso, un importante apoyo para el desarrollo de esta práctica, ¿no? Considerando que a veces existen muchas limitaciones a nivel del Estado pues para la adquisición de ciertas tecnologías, ¿no? O también pues para el acceso a profesionales especializados. Entonces, en este caso, el equipo de PRONAVEC ha brindado un importante apoyo desarrollando este modelo, desarrollando el instrumento pictórico que nos ha permitido pues iniciar con el diagnóstico para todo el proceso que continúa en esta actividad, ¿no? Y bueno, finalmente, sobre las implicancias en política pública, nosotros como Observatorio de Criminalidad tenemos claro que para el desarrollo de políticas es necesario gestionar información clara, información oportuna, información que permita contribuir a los procesos de toma de decisiones, ¿no? En ese contexto, el modelo que hemos desarrollado está orientado, y que está orientado principalmente a la identificación de niños, niñas y adolescentes víctimas y potenciales víctimas de estos delitos, debería estar principalmente orientado pues al diseño de un servicio de prevención, de persecución penal y de protección que permita atender de forma adecuada y oportuna las demandas de este grupo vulnerable y de sus familias. Y con ello puedes crear un valor social a partir del análisis delictual, ¿no? A partir de ese proceso de generación de información, de gestión de información que estamos seguros que es importante en todos aquellos procesos para el desarrollo de políticas públicas, ¿no? Bueno, agradecerle entonces, hemos hecho una síntesis de esta práctica, dejamos nuestra información institucional y esperamos pues seguir contribuyendo en este proceso. Que tengan un buen día, gracias.
Muchas gracias por su intervención, Brenda, y a todos los equipos que están detrás de las dos iniciativas seleccionadas y presentadas el día de hoy. Cabe recordar que las intervenciones efectuadas corresponden a iniciativas ganadoras del concurso de buenas prácticas. Este reconocimiento se entrega a quienes se han destacado por su aporte a la convivencia y seguridad en nuestras ciudades. Felicidades a todos los proyectos seleccionados. Las exposiciones estarán disponibles en nuestra página web www.pazciudadana.cl. Finalmente, para cerrar este primer día de conferencia, iniciaremos la última intervención del día. Les recordamos que para hacer sus preguntas al expositor deben hacer clic en el botón Preguntas y Respuestas en el costado de la pantalla. A continuación, entonces, quiero invitarlos y darle la bienvenida a la charla magistral de la profesora Deborah Quetzle, del Departamento de Justicia Criminal de la John Jay College de Justicia Criminal, investigadora del Instituto Correccional de la Universidad de Cincinnati. Su presentación de la jornada de hoy se titula Estrategias para prevenir la reincidencia delictual de los jóvenes infractores de ley. Bienvenida, profesora Coetzle.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. All right.
Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'm Debbie Ketzel. On the faculty at John Jay College, and my research really focuses around reducing recidivism. So once someone is in the system, how do we help them improve? How do we help them be successful while they're on supervision? And more importantly, how do we help them be successful when they're no longer under supervision? And so I'm really excited to be here this morning. I apologize for the English. I'm actually in Mexico right now taking Spanish lessons. So hopefully next time or at some point in the future, I can have the chance to speak with you in Spanish. But I think for today, English is better. I've been doing some work recently in Latin America and specifically in Central America. And so, thinking a lot about how these strategies that have really been developed in Canada and the US translate or not to other settings. And so far, I think the research is suggesting that they do. Human behavior is human behavior, although acknowledging that I think there are ways that we need to consider cultural differences. And so I'll try to talk about that a little bit as we go through this morning's presentation on strategies for reducing recidivism. I want to start by just acknowledging that punishment alone should not be expected to reduce recidivism. We should not expect incarcerating people or putting people on probation or some sort of community supervision to change behavior in the long term. The research is pretty clear on this point. And so here we see results from a study conducted by Don Andrews and Jim Bonta some years ago, looking at the effectiveness of supervision programs versus treatment interventions. And what we see here is that supervision alone, punishment alone, is actually associated with increases in recidivism, whereas providing treatment services, interventions designed to change behavior or thoughts around criminal behavior is associated with reducing recidivism. And so just making the point that, and in the US, we have a long history of just sort of wanting to punish people. But if we really want to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for youth, we need to make sure that we're providing effective interventions. The other reality, though, is that not all treatment is equally effective, that there are some studies, or rather some programs, that are significantly more effective than others. And so it's not enough just to say, let's put people into a treatment program or some sort of treatment intervention. We really need to make sure that those programs are designed in a way that is supported by the research. And so I want to spend this morning really talking to you about the risk need responsivity framework, or the R&R framework. My sense is that it's made its way to Chile and other countries in South America and Central America, at least somewhat, but I'm not sure that it's being fully implemented yet. So I just want to sort of talk through the principles, think about what this looks like in practice, and what that means for programs being designed and implemented in various jurisdictions. So we're going to talk about 4 principles specifically. To be honest, I think there are about 18 principles, depending on how you count, but I want to talk about these 4 primary ideas, which involve the risk principle and has implications for who we target for interventions, the need principle, which has implications for the type of treatment targets, the behaviors that we're focusing on, the responsivity principle, which has implications for how we go about providing services. And then finally, this idea of fidelity, or making sure that it's not just that we have a well-designed program, but also that that program is being delivered with integrity, that it's being delivered how indeed it was designed to be. And so we'll talk about each of those a little bit more. First, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when I'm using the term risk, because we can think about risk in a lot of different ways. There's the, and in this way, we're talking specifically about the risk of recidivism. So the likelihood of getting into trouble again. So someone who is higher risk has a higher likelihood, a higher probability of recidivating or reoffending or getting into trouble, whereas someone who is lower risk has a lower probability. This is not to say that all high-risk people will reoffend. We're thankfully not that good at prediction. And at the same time, the reality is among low-risk people, 1 or 2, 10% maybe, might reoffend. And so these aren't exact definitions, they're really just probabilities, or the propensity of reoffending, and it's on a continuum then of low to high risk. I think when we talk about risk, some people think about, risk of teen pregnancy or risk of maybe dropping out of school, and just focusing here that we're really specifically talking about the risk of recidivism. So within that context, then, the risk principle says that we need to match the level of service and supervision to the level of risk. What this means is that for youth that are identified as higher risk, they have a higher probability of reoffending, of getting into trouble again, they should receive more intensive services. They should receive more intensive supervision. And for low-risk youth, those youth that are assessed as having a low probability of reoffending, we really should provide minimal, if any, service to those individuals. Ideally, we would sort of triage those low-risk youth out of the juvenile and criminal justice systems and sort of just leave them alone, and with the idea that they should correct their behavior on their own. What the research tells us consistently is that when we overserve low-risk youth or low-risk individuals, we can do harm. And we see an example of this here. These are results from a study done by my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, Chris Lowenkamp and Ed Latessa. For this study, they were interested in looking at the effectiveness of programs for youth. They followed close to 15,000 juveniles for a period of 2 years. And these juveniles received services in one of about 350 different types of programs. And so within that, there were community-based programs, residential programs, and then institutional programs, detention or youth prisons. And part of what they looked at was the outcomes of these youth by setting and risk level. For this study, recidivism was defined as a new conviction over a 2-year period. And what we see here is this, and I apologize, I realized almost all of my bars are blue, but this sort of medium shade of blue represents low-risk youth, youth that have a low likelihood of reoffending. And when they were served in the community, they had an 8% recidivism rate. 8% were reconvicted in that 2-year period. When low-risk youth were served in residential settings, they had a 20% recidivism rate. These are youth that had the same likelihood of reoffending, the same probability of reoffending, but putting them into that increased level of supervision, the increased level of service drove recidivism rates up, which is obviously not what we want to do, right? And we spent money to do this. So we're using resources ineffectively and doing harm to youth. You'll notice that there were no low-risk youth in the institution, and that's because this particular state precludes low-risk youth from being institutionalized. But I think these findings, really speak to the need to keep low-risk youth at home. We can look at the results also for the very high risk. And here we see that very high risk in the youth in the community had a 41% recidivism rate compared to 29% in residential settings and 30% in institutional settings. And so just as overserving youth, low-risk youth can do harm, underserving high-risk youth can equally do harm. And so we just really want to be mindful of the types of decisions that we're making about where we place youth and the type of services that we're providing them so that we're matching them appropriately. I also just want to point out that among our high risk, they performed pretty much the same across community, residential, and institutional settings. And so I think the takeaway from this is that even among our high-risk youth, we don't automatically want to incarcerate them or put them into residential settings. I think that in the US at least, the idea of incarceration has sort of been the default option for a number of years. And what these results tell us is that we don't have to do that. That should only be when necessary and should be maybe sort of more the exception than the rule. So what this means then is that we need to have risk assessments. If we want to match the level of service to the level of risk, we need to know what someone's probability of reoffending is. And so there are a number of standardized risk assessments that have been developed and used throughout the US, Canada, and many, many other countries, including some in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what these instruments tend to have in common is that they are largely based on these central 8 risk factors, which have been identified by Andrews and Bonta and many other researchers. And so just briefly, regardless of the exact tool that you're using, you should have a risk assessment tool that looks at these types of factors. So assesses for the presence of antisocial attitudes or thoughts that are supportive of criminal behavior. If I don't think that it's a problem to use violence when I feel disrespected, then I'm going to use violence when I feel disrespected. Or if I think that it's okay to use drugs because everyone does it, then I'm likely to continue using drugs. Our assessments should be looking for the type of companions that someone has. Do they have antisocial or delinquent and criminal peers? Or do they have peers that are good influences? You know, if you have teenagers, you tend to want them to spend time with the good kids. And that's because the good kids will have a good influence. We don't want them to spend time with the kids that are in trouble, because those kids, those youth, tend to have negative influences. We want to make sure that we're looking at antisocial personality characteristics. And I'm not talking about antisocial disorder or antisocial personality disorder, but rather characteristics associated with recidivism. So things like having low self-control, being impulsive, engaging in risk-seeking behaviors, having poor decision-making skills, sort of those personality traits that define how we interact with our environment. And what we know is when people have some of these personality traits, particularly coupled with antisocial peers or antisocial attitudes, the risk of reoffending goes up. Of course, we know that substance use disorder is associated with crime and recidivism, so we want to be attentive to that, as well as family dynamics. Youth do better when they have supportive families, caring families that reinforce positive behaviors. And so if there's a lot of conflict in the family, or parents maybe aren't doing such a great job of parenting, we want to work on those types of things. We know from the research that youth that get into trouble at an earlier age are more likely to continue getting into trouble, that they tend to sort of miss out on developing some of those pro-social skills, coping skills. And so we need to be attentive to that. Being involved in educational settings, going to school is a protective factor. So we want to make sure that we're assessing for their engagement in school, both are they going to school, but also how are they doing at school? And then finally, we want to make sure that we're looking at how people use their free time. Are they using their free time in very passive, unconstructive ways that lead them to getting into trouble? Or are they using their free time in ways that sort of surrounds them with a number of positive influences? And so when we're thinking about providing effective services, we want to make sure that we have an assessment in place that is covering these types of factors. How these factors look might be a little bit different country to country, region to region, in terms of how we measure them, but the general ideas should hold true. Now, I recently, with my colleagues at John Jay, did a scan of the literature to look at the extent to which standardized risk assessments and risk and need assessments have been tested or implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I know on a screen this is probably difficult to read, but this guide is available for free, and so happy to share the link if people are interested in it. But what we see is that, you know, some countries have done a lot of testing of various risk assessments. Chile, Peru, for example. Honduras has had a number of research studies there looking at the use of risk assessment. And so you sort of get the sense that the use of these tools is starting to happen in the region, but I don't think that it's widespread yet. And so I think we really need to be taking a closer look at how to implement and test these tools to make sure that programs have the correct information so that they can appropriately target the right youth. In addition to thinking about risk, we also want to make sure that we're adhering to the need principle. And the need principle says that we can reduce the likelihood of recidivism by assessing and targeting criminogenic needs, and that we do this with deliberate, structured interventions. What are criminogenic needs? Quite simply, they're dynamic risk factors. So those central 8 risk factors that can be changed are the things that we should be targeting with our interventions. If someone has a drug problem, we should be providing treatment focusing on reducing their drug use. If someone has impulsivity, low self-control, then we should be providing them interventions that are designed to increase their levels of self-control, increase perhaps their decision-making. And when we do that, we're reducing the likelihood, well, we're reducing the presence of those risk factors, which means reducing the likelihood of recidivism. Here we see some examples of criminogenic needs and what we call non-criminogenic needs. And so again, you see examples of criminogenic needs include things like improving problem-solving skills, anger management or emotional regulation skills, improving family functioning, reducing criminal thinking, changing those attitudes that are supportive of criminal behavior. So we should assess youth for their risk and needs and then make sure that our interventions are targeting those needs or risk, dynamic risks that are present. We also see here non-criminogenic needs. And in both cases, these are just examples, not an all-inclusive list. But non-criminogenic needs are factors that might be important, right? If someone is struggling with mental health, if they have depression or anxiety, those are important things to be considering and to be addressing. But what the research tells us is that non-criminogenic needs are not driving recidivism. And so what that means is that if we only focus on non-criminogenic needs, we're not likely to change recidivism. We're not likely to change those outcomes. Now, for those low-risk youth, perhaps targeting mental health. If we have a low-risk youth who has depression and we should divert them out of the system and make them referrals for mental health treatment. And that's probably all we need to do. But when we're talking about higher risk youth, those youth that have a higher likelihood of reoffending, if all we target is mental health or depression or physical activity, we're missing out on their criminogenic needs. And so what we're doing is maybe making them healthier in some ways, which is good, but we're not addressing the factors that are driving their likelihood of recidivism. And so we shouldn't really expect to see changes then in their long-term behavior. And here we see results from a study done by Paul Gendreau and his colleagues that were looking at the density of treatment targets. And so, the truth is, especially in residential and institutional settings, that we do target some non-criminogenic needs and the same in the community. But the priority, the emphasis should be on those criminogenic needs. And here in this study, this is a meta-analysis, when programs targeted at least 4 to 6 more criminogenic needs, so the balance was heavily weighted towards criminogenic needs, they reduced recidivism an average of 31%. When the balance was more even of criminogenic to non-criminogenic needs, there was limited reduction in recidivism. And in fact, the average effect was 0. And so the point is, our focus should be on criminogenic needs because those are the needs, those are the factors that are driving the likelihood of recidivism. I think what happens is we have a tendency to focus on general well-being, as we should, but we do that at the exclusion of these other very important factors. And so really thinking about how you balance and prioritize case plans around these need areas. So risk tells us who to target, higher risk youth. Need tells us what, right? We need to target these criminogenic needs. The responsivity principle then tells us how to go about doing this. And responsivity is really about acknowledging that people respond to interventions differently. We're all unique. We all have individual styles, individual preferences, and we want to make sure that we're matching people to services that are best suited to them. If you've ever tried to put a square peg into a round hole, you know it doesn't work very well. And yet we do that a lot of times with youth, right? We put them into sort of a one-size-fits-all group, and it's not always the best match for them. And so responsivity is saying we need to be attentive to these individual differences and making sure that we're removing or taking away any barriers to being successful in a treatment setting. When we talk about responsivity, we can talk about both general responsivity and specific responsivity. General responsivity is really about the treatment approach that we should be using. And the research consistently tells us that behavioral and cognitive behavioral techniques are more effective than other approaches when we're trying to change behavior. And this is true not just for trying to change criminal behavior, but really any type of behavior. If you have tried to quit smoking, if you have tried to lose weight, behavioral programs are more effective at bringing about change and allowing for that change to sustain itself. And we'll talk in just a second a little bit more about what that means or what that looks like in practice. In addition to making sure that we have an effective treatment approach in place, we also want to make sure that we're utilizing core correctional practices. So a lot of times when I work with agencies, with a probation agency, for example, they refer someone to a treatment agency. And so you have your probation officer and your treatment group. And the treatment group maybe is doing behavioral types of techniques. But the truth is the probation officer also has a lot of influence on the individual, on the youth being served. And so we want to make sure that everyone, all criminal justice actors or juvenile justice actors that a youth comes into contact with is using core correctional practices, interacting with youth in a way that has been found to be effective. So that means things like building a therapeutic alliance, working collaboratively with youth. It means teaching problem-solving skills so that youth are empowered to have the ability to solve a problem or sort of manage risky situations, those situations where they might be more likely to get into trouble again. Core correctional practices includes the use of reinforcers and punishers to help shape behavior. It's not just punishment, right? But how do we reinforce new behaviors so that people are more likely to use those again? And of course, making sure that officers and staff are using their authority effectively, and that when they do need to sanction or indicate disapproval, that they do so in an effective manner, right? There's a lot of research talking about how to interact with youth and people in the justice system. And so my point here is that it's not just the program itself, but it's also the types of skills and characteristics that our staff have and possess that matters when we're talking about reducing recidivism. When I talk about behavioral programs, I'm specifically talking about very active, present focus types of programs. So when I go and observe groups, a lot of times I see a bunch of kids sitting in a circle talking about hypothetical situations, right? Well, I got into trouble this one time because, Juan came up and he offered me drugs and I didn't really want to do it, but I didn't know how to say no. So we just went and partied. And then there's this discussion about, well, what would you do next time? The problem is those discussions, those hypotheticals, don't teach people the actual skills that they need to manage these high-risk situations, to manage situations, people, places, or things where they're more likely to get into trouble. Behavioral programs are really about focusing on the risk factors, the lack of coping skills here and now, and providing people concrete skills that they can apply to these different situations. And so they focus on the here and now, not the past. They're very individualized in the sense that we practice different scenarios that are specific to that individual. Behavioral programs use a lot of, as I said, practice, right? So we introduce perhaps the skill of deciding how to say no. And we walk through the steps of what is associated with making that decision, right? First, we have to recognize it's a problem for us. We have to make the decision, which means identifying consequences of if I do this or if I don't, and then make the decision that I want to say no, and then actually say no. So there's a number of different steps that go along with that. And a behavioral program is going to have a facilitator that models those different steps for the youth. They sort of show them, right? They demonstrate it for them. And then each youth has a chance to practice those different steps. And each youth can practice those different steps in scenarios that are real for them. And then they can practice it again. And we can make it increasingly more difficult, and we can have them practice when they're back home or in the community. And so in doing this, we're not just talking hypothetically, how would you handle a situation, but we're providing real concrete skills that are increasingly getting more difficult, which means they're increasingly mimicking reality. and becoming internalized that then they can use. The nice thing about behavioral programs is that they're relatively brief. The truth is we don't have 3 or 4 years to work with youth to try and change their behavior. But a good behavioral program, we can, with high-risk youth, maybe 6 or 9 months and see some real change in that individual. And they tend to be manualized, which means that regardless of who the facilitator is, we're all providing the same type of service, the same intervention, and assuming it's done with fidelity, which means that it's not a luck of the draw on whether or not I get a really skilled therapist or not, right? All of my therapists should be skilled. They should all be trained on the curriculum in delivering the same type of intervention. And so this type of approach to treatment improves outcomes consistently. And so I'll show you a slide about that in just a second. So general responsivity is sort of the big picture. And then we have specific responsivity, which really now is about the individual. With specific responsivity, we can talk about both internal factors and external factors. And remember, these are factors that might make it difficult for someone to be successful in an intervention. Addressing these factors is not thought to directly impact recidivism, but rather it increases the likelihood that someone can complete a group, complete an intervention. And we know that if someone successfully completes an intervention, they're also more likely to be successful after that intervention. So examples of internal factors include things like cognitive abilities, to be honest, some curricula, some cognitive behavioral curriculums are quite abstract. And if you have someone who has limited cognitive functioning, they might not do very well in that type of group. And so we would want to match them accordingly, right? We might want to think about issues of literacy. There are some curricula that require a lot of reading and writing. And if you have someone who doesn't read or write very well, then they're not going to do very well in that group unless we make adaptations for them. We can think about issues of age. Again, if you have teenagers, you probably don't want your 12-year-old hanging out with 18-year-olds, simply because we know those 18-year-olds can be a bad influence on the 12-year-olds, and their life experiences are vastly different. So all of these are factors that we want to take into consideration as we're assigning people to facilitators and to groups. We want to make sure that we're matching the individual needs of someone, their individual responsivity factors, with the type of service that they're receiving. We also want to be attentive to these external factors, right? Things that are sort of outside the control or direct control of the individual. So things like transportation. I live in New York City. Depending on where I'm trying to go, it could take me an hour and a half to get someplace. And if we refer someone to a group that takes them an hour and a half and 2 buses, and they're not super motivated, they're probably not going to show up. And so we want to be mindful of those issues, things like transportation, things like homelessness. It's hard to think about changing behavior when you don't have a safe, secure space to live. And so if we're working with youth that are homeless, or food insecure, we want to make sure that those needs are being met so then they can be successful in those group interventions. And you see here, I also have factors like gang affiliation and family support, which overlap with some of our risk factors. But thinking about how, gang affiliation or limited family support can have a negative impact on our ability to do well in a group setting. So let's say I'm super motivated to change my behavior and I really, really want to do good, but I get home and my family sort of undermines the changes that I'm trying to make, or sort of punishes me for trying to make those changes. We need to be attentive to those issues. So general responsivity is about the type of treatment using behavioral approaches, and specific responsivity is really about those individual differences and how we need to address them to allow people to focus on the treatment, on the intervention itself. There's been a lot of research done around the effectiveness of behavioral interventions, general responsivity, and here we see results from another meta-analysis where behavioral interventions have on average a 29% reduction in recidivism, whereas non-behavioral interventions, so educational, psychoeducational, sort of client-centered process groups, can reduce recidivism, but only here by about 7%. And so if we have to choose the nature of our intervention, we should choose those that are more likely to have greater reductions in recidivism. I should acknowledge we don't do as much, there hasn't been as much research on specific responsivity. There's more and more research coming out looking at issues of motivation. I'm really interested in the idea of language and how that impacts someone's ability to learn or not. But right now, most of the meta-analyses have really focused on behavioral interventions. And I think that's just because it's easier, quite frankly, to study. So how does this all come together? Well, there's been a lot of research looking at the effectiveness of programs based on the number of principles that they're adhering to. And this is results from just one study. This has been replicated time and time again with both adults and juveniles, men and women, and across different types of offender groups. And what we find is that programs that fail to adhere to any of these principles, on average, increase recidivism by about 2%. Programs that do at least one of the three tend to reduce recidivism, but I would say only marginally, right? Here, this outcome is a 2% reduction. Programs that do at least two, so they're adhering to risk, need, and or responsivity, at least two of those three, on average reduce recidivism about 18%, and those that are adhering to all three, so they're targeting higher risk people, they're targeting criminogenic needs, and they're using a behavioral approach, on average reduce recidivism in this study about 26%. There are some other studies where that number has gotten up to about 35, 36%, but either way, it's a pretty substantial decrease in recidivism and really speaks to the need to incorporate these ideas into practice. I want to acknowledge, though, that even a really well-designed program can fail if it's not being done well, if it's not being delivered as designed. And I mentioned the fidelity principle earlier, and here we see some results from a study that looked at this issue. There is a program called Functional Family Therapy. It's a well-supported curriculum. It's designed for juveniles, where facilitators or therapists work with a juvenile and their family to improve the functioning of that family unit, and has been found time and time again to reduce recidivism, to improve outcomes. There's a lot of training that goes into play with this curriculum, and a lot of oversight with this curriculum. Robert Bernowski in the state of Washington did a study looking at the effectiveness of FFT in Washington state when it was delivered with fidelity versus without. And so they rated all of the therapists, the facilitators delivering FFT, as delivering FFT competently or not, right, with fidelity or not. And here we see that when FFT was delivered with fidelity, there was a 38% reduction in recidivism. When it drifted, when facilitators sort of did their own thing, they didn't deliver the program as designed, recidivism rates went up. So even well-designed programs can fail if they're not done well. What this means then is we want to make sure that we're designing programs well and that they're being delivered well. And so we want to have checks in place, right? We want to have ways to monitor the quality of our programs. And programs can and should be doing this internally through quality assurance types of activities. They should be observing groups and providing feedback to staff. They should be providing supervision to staff and training. They should be monitoring assessments and case plans, making sure that all those are done with fidelity. It's also important, of course, that the program is designed with integrity and in alignment with with the research. One way that we can measure this is through the correctional program checklist. I'll just talk about this very briefly, but the CPC is a tool that, again, was developed at Cincinnati. I'm definitely showing my bias here for UC. Was developed by my colleagues at Cincinnati and is a way to measure how closely a program is in alignment with evidence-based practices, with the research. The checklist has about 80 different items. I think it's 78 different items across these 5 different domains. And most of these items are rated as a 0 or 1. You're doing it or not. And so within this checklist, we're looking really at 2 main ideas. One is capacity. Does this program have the capacity or the ability to deliver effective interventions? Is there strong leadership in place? Is there support from stakeholders? Was the program designed with a review of the literature in place? What about the staff? Are staff hired because they believe in the idea of change and they have the skills necessary to deliver interventions? Do they receive training? Do we make an investment in our staff? And do we provide feedback and coaching to them to help them continue to improve? We can look at issues of quality assurance. How well do programs monitor themselves? We know that drift will occur, but if we have monitoring and evaluation activities in place, then that drift can be caught and stopped and corrected. So we look at capacity, and then we also look at content. Is a program designed according to the R&R principles? And is it being delivered in that way? So what types of assessments are programs doing? Are they assessing for risk, need, and responsivity? Are they using validated tools to do so? And what is the nature of the treatment? Are they using the results of the assessments to drive treatment decisions, to drive case plans? And then are they using behavioral approaches? Are they working with family members and so forth? And so this is a tool that can be used to really give you a sense of the quality of a program. It's not the same as an evaluation, but it can be done in a day or two and give some immediate feedback to a program and some feedback about where it needs to make improvements, where it's doing well, and ultimately how likely it is to be effective. And so I just want to show you quickly some results of assessments. So these are sort of normed, the mean scores on the CPC across 670 different programs that have been assessed. This includes juvenile and adult programs, institutional and community-based programs, as well as residential. So sort of the whole gamut of programs. And so these, and I should also acknowledge that these programs are largely based in the US and Canada, some in Singapore, I think in Guam. I don't know of any programs to date that have been assessed in Latin America, so just acknowledging that. But here we see the overall results, and you'll see that overall, across these 660 programs, the average score or the average rating is about 49%, which is rated in the moderate adherence to EBP. So our programs are doing okay, but they should be doing a lot better. You'll also see that our scale is sort of shifted downward. If we're thinking about percentages and grading, and if I got a 65% in school, I would have been in a lot of trouble. But 65% here is considered to be very high adherence to evidence-based practice. And that's because we know that, you know, all of this research, putting in, it's not possible to do everything, right? That life is complicated, and we have judges that want certain things, and there are community factors that impact how we can do things. And so the scale is sort of adjusted to acknowledge for that. Nonetheless, we see overall programs score about 49%. They tend to do pretty well in terms of leadership and staff. Doing okay on assessment. I think assessment practices have really improved in the last 20 years in the US and Canada at least. Not doing so well in terms of quality assurance and treatment activities. In the US, many of our correctional programs historically have failed to monitor themselves. They just, QA has been sort of an afterthought, and you see that reflected here. And in terms of treatment, I think this really just speaks to the challenges of implementing behaviorally based programs and implementing them well and being able to match. So we know that it's difficult in an area that we need to work with programs much more. When we look at the distribution of scores, so that overall rating, we see that about a third of the programs that have been assessed, again, in the 660 programs, have fallen into the high or very high adherence to evidence-based practices. About 40% fall into low adherence, and about 23-24% moderate adherence. You'll notice this line here, and what that line really represents is sort of a breaking point between programs that tend to be reducing recidivism and programs that are less likely to reduce recidivism. There aren't a lot of validation studies on the CPC or tools like it, simply because methodologically it gets a little bit complicated because you need a number of programs that have been assessed, and you need outcomes and comparison groups. But nonetheless, the research does suggest that when programs score in the high and very high adherence categories, they're more likely to reduce recidivism. And so again, what this suggests to me is that in the US, at least, we have fairly high recidivism rates, and I would argue that at least some of that is a result of the quality of services that we're providing, that we need to do a better job in terms of our design of services and implementation of those services if we want to bring recidivism rates down. And here you just see, these are results from one of the studies that helped to shape the CPC. Programs that were rated as less than 60% on this measure of program integrity increased recidivism, whereas once programs hit that 60% mark and above, recidivism rates came down. And so again, just really speaking to the importance of designing programs in a way that's consistent with the research if we want to reduce recidivism. And so the implications of all this to me are, I think, pretty clear. First, we need to make sure that we're using standardized assessments. If we want to be able to match youth to the right types of services, we need to know what their risk and need levels are. That's sort of the foundation. That's the first step of providing effective interventions. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're providing behavioral interventions, right? And this should be both in terms of how staff work with people, as well as how the groups are designed and delivered. If we want to change behavior, we need to use approaches that are most likely to do so. And thirdly, we really need to invest in our staff. Again, both our treatment staff as well as our correctional staff. We need to provide training to them. We need to provide support to them. We need to coach them so that they can work with youth in a way that is most likely to result in their success. And so I think it's safe to say changing behavior is difficult. It's not easy, but it is possible. And that to me is sort of the goal here, is that we, I believe, have a responsibility to improve our services so that we can serve youth better. And so we need to make sure that we are designing programs and delivering programs in a way that indeed are targeting those youth that are in need of the services, that we're identifying and targeting those criminogenic needs. And if your jurisdiction doesn't have services in place, that you're developing them, right? So that we can provide the needed services, that we're attentive to those individual differences and really take away the barriers to success, and that we're constantly monitoring and improving our services so that we can indeed have better outcomes for youth, because ultimately that means better outcomes for our communities, for youth, for their families, for all of us. And personally, I think that should always be our goal. So with that, I think I'm done, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias por su presentación, profesora Koetzle. Resulta muy pertinente. Recién a inicios de este año fue aprobado en la Cámara de Diputados el proyecto de ley que viene a reformar el nuevo servicio de responsabilidad penal, es Servicio Nacional de Reinserción Social Juvenil, ¿no? Que justamente tiene el desafío de poder abordar de manera efectiva a estos jóvenes. Y al respecto quisiéramos hacerle dos preguntas. Nos han llegado muchas preguntas, pero tenemos tiempo para resolver dos, ¿no? Entonces, partiremos con la primera, que considero que es muy importante, dado lo que nos ha mencionado respecto a adherencia, fidelidad, en la implementación, ¿no? No basta con tener un modelo sólido, sino que también es que se implemente de manera fiel. Y para ello quisiéramos saber cuáles son las competencias que se tienen que considerar en la formación de los recursos humanos que trabajan con adolescentes infractores, ¿no? ¿Qué experiencias positivas recomienda que miremos?
Okay. And so if I understood the question correctly, thinking about the issue of fidelity and staff training. And so what are the skills and values that we should be looking for in terms of hiring staff, and how do we best support them through training? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. So great question, because, you know, ultimately I think it's about us, right? And I think it's about how we work with youth. And so we want to select staff that believe change is possible, right? They're not just doing it for the money. I mean, the money's usually not that great, at least in the US, but they really believe in the idea of change and that there's hope for these youth. I think we want to hire staff that have good boundaries, right? So we want to develop alliances with the people that we're working with, but we also want to make sure that our roles are kept clear. And so having good boundaries is important. I think being firm but fair, right? And so not being quick to punish someone or respond punitively, but being predictable and consistent in how we work with people so that we can establish those boundaries, but treat everyone with dignity and respect and kindness is incredibly important. You know, the research would say that people should have some education, right? Ideally, at least a couple of years of school and some exposure to this type of research, right? That they should have some knowledge about why they're doing the services that they're providing. In terms of training, what I would recommend to programs is that staff are trained before they start working with youth, right? Which seems common sense, but we don't do that in the US. We just sort of throw people into it. That they receive training on the theory of the program, on the assessment tools that they're using, on the curricula, but also that they have training specifically on how to use behavioral intervention so that they're very adept at being able to model appropriate behaviors and new skills, as well as provide reinforcement to youth as they're practicing through. And I think the important point for me is that it's not just that initial training, but it's ongoing support, so that there should be, whether it's weekly meetings or clinical supervision or booster sessions, where we're sort of constantly talking about skills and practice and building those, that it's a continuing process and not a one-time process. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y la última pregunta que le quisiéramos hacer es saber qué opinión le merece el uso de los instrumentos de riesgo para determinar la pena, el castigo a imponer.
Great question, and one that we're definitely discussing a lot in the US these days, particularly because, you know, they're tools, they're instruments, and they're not immune to criticism, and they're certainly not perfect. So first I want to say that assessment is not new, right? We assess youth all the time. What the research tells us is that structured approaches or standardized approaches to assessment is better than unstructured approaches. Okay, so making sure that we're all using the same approach to assessment and coming to the same conclusions is important, right? Versus sort of, you know, I think it's all about drug use, and this person thinks it's all about family, and that person thinks it's all about friends, and we come up with very different ratings depending on our individual bias. Whether or not risk assessments should be used to decide the punishment, I think not. I think that as much as possible, we want to keep people with limited exposure to our justice systems, right? We know that, again, at least in the US, we tend to do a lot of harm. So I think that when we do risk need assessments, as I said earlier, we want to divert those low risk youth out, right? Let's use these assessments to say, leave this person alone, and not overserve them, not take them away from all of the positive stuff that's already going on in their life, and let them be. For our people that are assessed as moderate and higher risk, I think we want to use our assessments to determine the types of interventions that they need. And as I said, I think the default should always be staying in the community. We know effects are better when people are home, and that we put people into residential services or institutional services only when necessary, only when there's not another option. And acknowledging that sometimes if someone has committed a very egregious crime, that there are other factors that come into play. Beyond, you know, there are legal reasons, there are political reasons, there are public reasons for why decisions are made. But I think that we should use the assessments to minimize the harm that we do. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, a lot.
Perfect.
Con esta valiosa respuesta y opinión que nos ha dado la profesora Coetzle, damos por finalizada la primera jornada del 12º día de Conferencia Internacional Desafíos de la Seguridad en nuestras ciudades, gestión de los territorios para la prevención del delito y la violencia. Quiero agradecer a los dos expositores que nos acompañaron el día de hoy con las charlas magistrales. Han resultado muy valiosas y pertinentes para los desafíos que nuestro país enfrenta el día de hoy. Gracias también a todos quienes se conectaron. Esperamos que todo lo expuesto hoy les sea de gran utilidad. Los esperamos mañana desde las 9 en la segunda jornada, cuya temática será violencia y delincuencia en barrios y ciudades. Muchas gracias, cuídense mucho y hasta mañana.